She gets nothing. She is not even real family." My mother grinned across the polished mahogany table. The estate lawyer set down his sterling silver pen, looking at her with profound pity. "Interesting. So nobody told you?" My brother leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Told us what?" The lawyer sighed, tapping the thick stack of legal parchment. "Well, she is the one who holds the primary." I caught the lawyer's eye and offered a microscopic shake of my head. The trap needed more time. My mother's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her pristine features. "My name is Idana Mitchell. I am 33 years old, and I just bought the debt that owns my entire family's existence. Before I tell you how I dismantled a logistics empire from a cheap apartment, welcome to Maria Tells Stories. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, treated like an unwanted guest in your own home, let me know your age and where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to hear how ordinary women answer impossible cruelty with cold, calculated silence." Frost crept along the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows, framing a gray, unforgiving view of Lake Geneva. Inside Julian Hay's law office, the temperature felt even colder. The air smelled of lemon oil polish and dry, circulated heat. I sat at the far end of the conference table, my hands resting quietly in the lap of my faded beige sweater. Across from me, the remaining heirs of the Mitchell logistics empire arranged themselves like royalty, holding court. My father had passed away 2 weeks prior, leaving behind a sprawling regional trucking and freight network. He was a man who valued ledger balances over human connection, and he had raised a family that mirrored his exact coldness. My mother, Vivian, sat with spine-snapping posture. She wore a vintage Chanel suit, her silver hair styled into an immovable helmet of perfection. Beside Vivian sat Preston, the heir apparent, tapping a heavy gold Rolex against the polished wood. Next to him, his wife Harper scrolled through her phone with practiced boredom, her designer acrylic nails clicking softly against the glass screen. They had summoned me here for a specific purpose. It was not to mourn. It was to execute a domestic purge. Julian cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he turned to the final page of the estate documents. Before he could speak the first syllable of the codicil, Vivian raised a single manicured hand. Her diamond ring caught the harsh overhead lighting. "Let us save the hourly billing rate, Julian," Vivian said, her voice smooth and chillingly pleasant. "You do not need to read the itemized list. Idana is not receiving a dime. My husband made his wishes clear before his heart failed. She is illegitimate, a mistake from a past he regretted. She gets nothing. She is not even real family." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Vivian tilted her chin up, offering me a look of pure, refined disdain. For 10 years, they had treated me like a ghost haunting the edges of their pristine lives. They believed I was a fragile, low-level data analyst working at a rural Milwaukee clinic, earning barely enough to survive. They kept me isolated in the drafty guest house on the edge of the family estate, a convenient secret hidden from their country club peers. They expected me to lower my head. They wanted the troubled, illegitimate daughter to cry, to beg for a meager inheritance, or to lash out in a fiery tantrum they could mock. I did not blink. I kept my breathing steady and shallow. When you spend a decade analyzing distressed corporate data and forensic municipal filings, you learn to separate emotion from the raw arithmetic of a situation. I did not look at Vivian. I shifted my gaze to my brother. Preston did not carry the relaxed confidence of a wealthy heir. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the table. I watched the subtle, involuntary betrayal of his own biology. A faint sheen of sweat gathered at his hairline, despite the drafty room. The rapid, uneven rise and fall of his chest indicated a spiked heart rate. When he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit to retrieve a leather checkbook, his thumb exhibited a distinct, rhythmic tremor. He was not acting out of grief or familial pride. He was operating on raw, suppressed panic. Preston hastily scribbled a figure onto the paper. The scratching of his fountain pen sounded exceptionally loud in the quiet room. He tore the slip of paper from the binding and slid it across the table. It glided over the polished mahogany and stopped inches from my folded hands. $500, Preston stated, his voice tight and strained. Consider it charity. You have until Friday to clear your junk out of the estate guest house. I want the keys left on the kitchen counter by noon. Do not make me call the county sheriff to forcibly remove you." Harper finally looked up from her screen. She offered a thin, amused smirk, shifting her weight in the leather chair. "Rent a U-Haul, Adana," Harper suggested, her tone dripping with polished condescension. "I am sure you can find a nice little studio apartment closer to that rural clinic you work at. It is time for you to face the real world. We have a buyer coming to look at the estate this weekend, and we cannot have you lingering around ruining the aesthetic." The puzzle pieces clicked together in my mind with lethal precision. They needed me gone. Not next month, not after the estate formally settled. Friday. Preston was sweating. He was selling the historic family home in a frantic rush. Healthy logistics empires do not liquidate generational real estate on a 4-day timeline. They were drowning. I looked down at the check. A condensation ring from a nearby crystal water glass had seeped into the paper, blurring Preston's frantic, trembling signature. He was trying to buy my silence and my swift exit for the price of a cheap motel stay. I slowly reached out and picked up a linen cocktail napkin from the center of the table. I deliberately dabbed the moisture off the edge of the check, smoothing the paper flat against the mahogany surface. I did not pick the money up. I left it sitting there, a monument to their fragile arrogance. "Keep the change, Preston," I said. My tone was hollow, stripped of any familial warmth or defensive anger. "You are going to need it." I stood up, pushing my heavy wooden chair back. I buttoned my plain wool coat, picking up my scuffed leather tote bag. I walked out of the law office without looking back to see the confusion ripple across my mother's face. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the building and stepped out into the biting Wisconsin winter. The wind howled off the frozen surface of the lake, stinging my cheeks. But the cold felt clarifying. The domestic war had officially begun. They thought they had just discarded a helpless squatter. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon to the executioner. I walked to my unassuming 10-year-old sedan parked at the edge of the snowy lot. I slid behind the wheel, shutting the heavy door to block out the howling wind. I did not turn the key in the ignition. Instead, I reached into a hidden compartment beneath the center console and pulled out a secondary, encrypted cellular phone. The screen glowed in the dim interior, casting a harsh blue light over my hands. I tapped a single contact name. The line connected after half a ring. Julian Hayes answered. His formal, impartial estate lawyer persona was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp, attentive cadence of a corporate proxy. "They are desperate, Julian." I instructed, my voice echoing in the quiet car. "Preston is trying to liquidate the estate by the weekend. He is hiding a massive liquidity crisis. I suspect a severe margin call on the logistics firm." Julian replied, the sound of rapid typing coming through the receiver. "He assumes evicting you clears the path for a quiet, rapid sale." "Do not let him breathe," I said, staring through the frost-covered windshield at the law office building. "Execute the Vanguard protocol. I want you to target the secondary debt market, buy up every defaulted commercial loan, every equipment lease, and every primary line of credit attached to the Mitchell name. Sweep the board. By Monday morning, I want Vanguard Holdings to own their entire existence." The heater in my 10-year-old sedan struggled against the Wisconsin winter, pushing a meager stream of lukewarm air over my numb fingers. I kept the encrypted phone pressed to my ear, listening to the rhythmic clicking of Julian typing on his keyboard, miles away in his own secure office. The biting frost clinging to my windshield served as a harsh mirror, reflecting the exact temperature of the memories I kept buried. Whenever the cold seeped into my bones like this, I was transported back to a specific night a decade ago. The air had smelled of crushed pine needles, spilled gin, and leaking radiator fluid. Preston had wrapped his brand-new Porsche around a retaining wall on a winding lakeside road. He was 25, heavily intoxicated, and bleeding from a superficial cut above his eyebrow. I was 23, sitting in the passenger seat, my shoulder bruised from the impact. As the distant wail of police sirens echoed through the dark woods, my mother pulled up in her own vehicle. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not check my pulse. Vivian marched through the sleet, her face a mask of calculated preservation, and ordered me to slide behind the steering wheel. Preston carries the family legacy Vivian had dictated, her voice slicing through the freezing rain. A drunk driving charge will ruin his position at the firm. You have no career. You have no future to protect. Tell the officers you were driving. You owe this family your compliance. When I refused to take the fall for a crime I did not commit, the retaliation was swift and merciless. The police arrived, and I told the truth. Preston faced a suspended license and a minor fine, a slap on the wrist buffered by expensive defense attorneys. But my punishment was permanent. The very next morning, the heavy mahogany doors of the estate slammed shut in my face. I was thrown out onto the street with a single suitcase and $40 in my pocket. Vivian wiped me from the family narrative, declaring me an ungrateful burden. They expected me to wither. They assumed a young woman with no financial safety net would eventually crawl back, begging for forgiveness and accepting whatever scraps they deemed appropriate. Instead, I vanished into a freezing, subterranean basement apartment in Milwaukee. I worked 80-hour weeks, sleeping on a stained mattress and surviving on generic canned soup. I secured an unassuming job as a data analyst at a rural medical clinic. It was the perfect camouflage. During the day, I processed patient billing records. At night, I taught myself the ruthless arithmetic of corporate finance. I studied distressed asset acquisition forensic accounting and the complex architecture of offshore holding companies. I funneled every spare dollar into algorithmic trading, capitalizing on regional bankruptcies. I weaponized my trauma, transforming my profound isolation into a private equity juggernaut named Vanguard Holdings. I became the unseen predator in the secondary debt markets, operating through layers of proxy firms. Vanguard was not born from a desire for luxury. It was forged as impenetrable armor against the people who had discarded me in the sleet. Julian stopped typing. His voice pulled me out of the decade-old memory and back into the driver's seat of my idling car. You were entirely correct, Adana. Julian reported, his tone shifting into the crisp cadence of a financial strategist. The facade they projected in that conference room is a house of cards. Mitchell Logistics is hemorrhaging capital at a fatal rate. Detail the bleeding, I instructed, shifting the car into gear to let the engine warm up. Preston has mismanaged the supply chain division for the past 18 months. Julian explained. Fuel costs skyrocketed, and rather than restructuring the client contracts, he took out high-interest bridge loans to cover the operational deficits. He cross-collateralized the logistics fleet with the primary corporate accounts. The lenders issued severe margin calls last Tuesday. The firm is insolvent. That explains the panicked rush to clear out the guest house. I murmured, watching a snowplow rumble past the parking lot. He needs to liquidate the Lake Geneva estate to inject emergency cash into the business before the quarterly audit exposes his failures. Exactly, Julian confirmed. He assumes the estate is his personal piggy bank. But selling a historic property requires a clean title and an empty premises. You occupying the secondary building complicates the appraisal and delays the listing. His $500 check was a desperate bid to remove the final obstacle to his survival. Do not let him reach the open market, I commanded, gripping the steering wheel. Execute the sweep. Buy the defaulted commercial paper from his primary lenders. Purchase the equipment leases for the trucking fleet. Acquire the mezzanine debt attached to the corporate headquarters. Offer the current creditors a premium buyout if they transfer the deeds immediately. Consider it done, Julian replied. The Vanguard shell accounts are fully funded and ready to deploy. Your brother will not even realize his debts have changed hands until we tighten the leash. We will hold the master deeds by Monday morning. I ended the call and slipped the encrypted device back into the hidden console compartment. A deep, abiding calm settled over me. The trap was armed. The logistics empire my father built the company Preston was currently destroying now belonged to the very daughter they had erased. Before I could pull out of the snowy parking lot, a sharp vibration rattled against my thigh. My primary cell phone, the cheap commercial device I used for my fabricated civilian life, lit up in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A new voicemail notification flashed brightly, displaying my mother's private number. I pressed the device to my ear and tapped the playback button. The automated system chimed, followed by the soft, syrupy cadence of Vivian Mitchell. "Idana, darling." Vivian purred, her voice dripping with a manufactured sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I am so deeply disappointed by your outburst in Julianne's office today. Walking out on your family during a time of grief is a clear sign that you are not managing your emotions well." I stared at the dashboard, tracking the subtle shift in her tone. The sweetness melted, revealing the icy threat lurking just beneath the surface. "Your brother and I have been talking." Vivian continued, her words paced with deliberate, surgical intent. "We are very concerned about your mental state. You have always been a troubled girl, prone to erratic behavior and delusions. Living alone in that drafty guest house has clearly exacerbated your instability. If you attempt to formally contest your father's will, or if you refuse to vacate the property by Friday, we will have no choice but to intervene for your own safety." A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. I knew exactly what she was implying. "I have spoken with the chief of psychiatry at Lake Geneva General." Vivian whispered, the velvet threat wrapping tightly around my throat. "He is a very close friend of the family. He agrees that a prolonged involuntary psychiatric hold might be necessary to properly evaluate your competence. We are prepared to sign the medical affidavits, Idana. Do not force my hand. Pack your things, take Preston's money, and disappear, or we will make sure you are placed somewhere far away where you cannot cause any more embarrassment." The recording clicked, ending the call. The static hummed in my ear. The air in the car suddenly felt dangerously thin. My mother was not merely issuing a harsh eviction notice. She was actively plotting to strip away my fundamental freedom. By threatening to weaponize the mental health system, Vivian intended to lock me in a psychiatric ward, effectively silencing my voice and erasing my legal rights to challenge the estate sale. They planned to brand me as legally incompetent, locking me behind heavy doors while Preston sold the ground out from under me. The domestic war had escalated far beyond a simple inheritance dispute. This was a battle for my autonomy, my liberty, and my survival. I could not just wait for the financial traps to spring on Monday. If Vivian filed those fraudulent medical affidavits, sheriff deputies would arrive at my door long before the banks opened. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. My pulse hammered a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. I had to dismantle my family's social and financial infrastructure before they could strike. I needed to isolate them, expose their crimes, and shatter their pristine reputations in the exact arenas they valued most. I shifted the sedan into drive, my boots pressing firmly against the accelerator. The tires gripped the salted asphalt as I pulled out of the law office parking lot. The storm was gathering, and it was time to let the snow fall. The automatic glass doors of the Lake Geneva Artisan Market slid open, welcoming me into a curated haven of immense privilege. The air inside smelled of imported truffle cheese, fresh organic basil, and dark roasted espresso beans. It was a space designed to separate the local elite from the harsh Wisconsin winter, offering $40 jars of olive oil and hand-poured chocolates. I grabbed a wire basket, keeping my posture relaxed and my gaze neutral. I needed basic provisions for my unassuming apartment, maintaining the illusion of my meager data analyst salary. Blending in was an essential tactic for survival. My sister-in-law Harper thrived in environments exactly like this. She viewed grocery shopping not as a mundane necessity, but as a competitive sport. Harper grew up in a middle-class suburb outside Milwaukee, spending her entire adolescence obsessing over designer catalogs and society pages. She married Preston the moment he secured his vice president title at the logistics firm, trading genuine affection for a black titanium credit card and a premium country club membership. Her entire identity hinged on the perception of her wealth. She required an audience to validate her existence. As I rounded the corner of the organic produce aisle picking up a bundle of asparagus, a cloying wave of signature floral perfume announced her arrival. Harper stood near the imported citrus display, flanked by two women wearing matching quilted riding jackets. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat, her blonde hair styled into effortless waves that cost hundreds of dollars to achieve. She spotted me through the aisle. Her eyes lit up with predatory delight. This was her stage, and I was the perfect prop to elevate her status in front of her peers. Harper approached her designer boots clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She did not lower her voice. She projected her words, ensuring the surrounding shoppers could hear every syllable of her manufactured pity. "Adana, what a surprise to see you here," Harper projected, stopping inches from my wire basket. "I assumed you would be knee-deep in cardboard boxes today. Have you found a moving truck yet? I hear the discount rental places book up fast on weekends." The two women behind her exchanged knowing, amused glances. They were feeding on the spectacle, enjoying the public degradation of the family outcast. I kept my hands resting lightly on the handle of my basket. I did not flinch or break eye contact. "I am handling my affairs, Harper. There is no need for your concern." Harper let out a high-pitched, breathy laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, I am not concerned. I am just relieved. Preston and I have been carrying the weight of this family for years. Now that we are finally clearing out the dead wood, we can focus on our own future." She leaned closer, her voice dripping with toxic smugness. "In fact, Preston just finalized the paperwork for our new winter chalet in Vail. 5 bedrooms, ski in, ski out. It is breathtaking. We are flying down next week to pick out the custom furnishings." My analytical mind began processing the raw data. A 5-bedroom ski chalet in Vail required a minimum of $3 million in liquid cash to close quickly. I already knew Preston was drowning in toxic debt, facing imminent margin calls from his primary lenders. He did not possess the personal capital to finance a luxury vacation home. That sounds very expensive. I replied, keeping my tone mild and conversational. "Preston must be receiving quite the holiday bonus this year." Harper smirked, eager to prove her husband's towering corporate dominance to her silent audience. "Preston does not need a bonus. He is the chief financial officer. He has access to VIP executive perks. He just unlocked a special commercial escrow reserve to cover the closing costs. He told me it is a temporary draw from the client holding accounts. The perks of running the empire, you know." The ambient noise of the artisan market faded into a dull, static hum. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Harper stood there practically glowing with pride, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic confession that had just spilled from her lips. She thought she was boasting about elite corporate maneuvers. She thought she was proving how untouchable her inner circle truly was. In her profound financial illiteracy, she had just confessed to a severe federal felony. Commercial escrow reserves are strictly regulated holding accounts containing client funds. They are legally protected deposits. They are not personal slush funds for failing executives to advance cash on luxury real estate. If Preston was siphoning capital from those specific accounts to float his failing lifestyle, he was actively committing commercial embezzlement. He was stealing directly from the logistics firm, clients likely hoping to replace the missing funds by selling the family estate before the quarterly auditors noticed the gaping hole in the ledger. The idiot had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him, wrapped in a neat bow by his own vain wife. I looked at Harper. I did not feel a spike of vindictive anger. I felt the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon identifying the exact location of a fatal tumor. "Client holding accounts," I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the space between us. "That is a very creative financing strategy. It is called high-level corporate finance, Adana." Harper sneered, adjusting the strap of her leather handbag. "You would not understand it. Just focus on packing your cheap sweaters. We fly to Colorado next Thursday." I offered her a chillingly polite smile, the kind of smile that rarely reaches the eyes, signaling danger to anyone paying close attention. "I would hold off on buying new ski gear, Harper," I advised, my voice smooth and lethal. Her perfectly drawn eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "Excuse me? Why would I do that?" "Because the weather in Vail can be incredibly unpredictable this time of year," I said, my gaze drilling into hers. "You might find yourselves dealing with a sudden, devastating avalanche." I did not wait for her to formulate a snappy retort. I turned away, leaving my wire basket sitting next to the imported fruit display. I walked calmly toward the automatic exit doors, ignoring the bewildered whispers of her socialite friends. The frigid winter air hit my face as I stepped back into the parking lot. My mind was racing, connecting the strategic dots. Vivian was threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my autonomy. Preston was embezzling client funds to maintain his illusion of wealth. The entire Mitchell dynasty was rotting from the inside out, held together only by arrogance and desperate fraud. I reached my sedan, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I pulled the encrypted phone from the console and dialed Julian. He answered on the first ring. "We have a new objective." I stated my tone devoid of any hesitation. Preston is not just liquidating the estate. He is actively stealing from the client escrow reserves to buy real estate in Colorado. A sharp intake of breath sounded on the other end of the line. Embezzlement. He is digging his own grave. He already dug the grave, I corrected. I want Vanguard to push him in. Deploy our forensic auditing team right now. I want them to infiltrate the Mitchell Logistics network and isolate the commercial holding accounts. Track every wire transfer Preston made over the last 30 days. Build the paper trail. The auditors will have the raw data within the hour. Julian confirmed the rapid clicking of his keyboard, returning. We will have undeniable proof of his felony before he finishes his afternoon coffee. Good, I said, gripping the steering wheel. Once the audit is secure, we move to the next phase. There is one more thing you need to know, Adana, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of profound irony. I just received a priority communication through the Vanguard corporate portal. What kind of communication, I asked, watching a snowflake drift onto my windshield. A desperate pitch deck. Julian replied, a dark amusement coloring his words. Preston just formally requested an emergency bailout meeting with the board of Vanguard Holdings. He wants to sell a controlling stake in the logistics firm to save himself from bankruptcy. A cold, triumphant realization washed over me. Preston was actively begging my company to rescue him. He was inviting the executioner right through his front door, entirely unaware that the sister he just threw out into the cold was the chief executive officer he was pleading with. The Lake Geneva Country Club stood as a monument to Midwestern old money. Its towering stone chimneys and sweeping manicured fairways projected an aura of impenetrable exclusion. Inside the grand dining room, crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over circular tables draped in heavy linen. The air hummed with the quiet clinking of silver cutlery and the low, curated laughter of Wisconsin elite. My mother, Vivian, had orchestrated this memorial luncheon not to grieve my father, but to solidify her reign. She viewed widowhood as a strategic social promotion. Dressed in a somber yet strikingly elegant black silk dress, she moved gracefully among the tables, accepting condolences like a monarch receiving tribute. She had explicitly barred me from attending, issuing strict instructions to the club management that Adana Mitchell was not welcome on the premises. She needed her narrative untainted by the physical presence of her discarded, illegitimate daughter. She assumed her instructions were ironclad. She believed her social capital was an impenetrable shield. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. The subtle shift in atmospheric pressure drew the attention of the nearest tables. I did not sneak in through the kitchen or argue with the front desk concierge. I walked straight through the main entrance, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal blazer, my posture rigid and unyielding. I did not arrive alone. My arm was resting lightly on the elbow of Richard Sterling, the senior executive vice president of the largest regional commercial bank in the state. Richard Sterling was a man who commanded absolute deference in rooms like this. He held the mortgages to half the estates surrounding the lake. Earlier that morning, Julian had finalized a strategic Vanguard maneuver, acquiring a massive block of toxic, non-performing loans off Richard's balance sheet, saving his institution from a catastrophic quarterly downgrade. When I requested he escort me to a local luncheon as a personal favor, he practically sprinted to his car. A ripple of stunned silence spread outward from the entrance, suffocating the ambient noise. Vivian froze mid-sentence, a crystal champagne flute hovering inches from her lips. Her eyes locked onto me, then shifted to the powerful banking executive acting as my personal escort. The mathematical equation forming in her mind simply did not compute. The outcast data analyst from the rural clinic was standing beside the apex predator of regional finance. I offered a slight, courteous nod toward the room. Richard smiled warmly, patting my hand before peeling off to greet a group of local developers. Vivian set her glass down with a sharp, audible crack against the table. The polished facade of the grieving widow evaporated instantly. She moved with predatory speed, cutting through the crowded room. She did not create a public scene. She operated with the silent, venomous efficiency of a seasoned socialite. She reached my side, her manicured fingers digging painfully into the fabric of my sleeve. "We need to speak, Adana." Vivian hissed her voice, a low, vibrating whisper. "Right now." She did not wait for a response. She pulled me aggressively toward the private coat room near the foyer, shoving the heavy velvet curtain aside. The space smelled of damp wool and expensive cedar hangers. The dim lighting offered a claustrophobic privacy. Vivian dropped my arm and spun around, her chest heaving beneath her silk dress. The veins in her neck pulsed against her diamond choker. "How dare you show your face here," Vivian snarled, the southern charm completely stripped away. "I gave specific orders to security. How did you manipulate Richard Sterling into bringing you? Are you blackmailing him? Are you selling yourself to pay your rent?" I stood perfectly still, letting her frantic energy burn itself out against my calm exterior. "You do not own the ground you walk on, Vivian," I replied, my voice steady and hollow. "You only rent the illusion." She stepped closer, invading my personal space, pointing a trembling finger inches from my face. "I am the queen of this town." Vivian spat, her eyes wide with unhinged arrogance. "I dictate who sits at the table and who starves in the cold. You think walking in here with a powerful man changes anything? You are a parasite. You are a mistake I have tolerated for far too long." I watched the spittle fly from her lips. She was operating on a decades-old playbook, relying on intimidation and the sheer force of her personality. She had no concept of the invisible, lethal currents shifting beneath her feet. "I will destroy you, Adana," Vivian promised, her voice dropping into a register of pure malice. "I will call the administrator at your pathetic little clinic tomorrow morning. I will tell them you are unstable, that you steal medication. You will be fired by noon. Then I will file the psychiatric affidavits. You will be locked in a padded room before the weekend is over. You will leave my estate, and you will leave this town, or I will bury you." She was panting, slightly breathless from her own toxic exertion. She expected me to shrink. She waited for the panic to register in my eyes, waiting for the broken daughter to apologize and retreat into the shadows. I did not shrink. I tilted my head, studying her with clinical detachment. "That is a very bold threat for a woman who has not paid her federal taxes in 3 years, I stated. Vivian froze. The manic energy drained from her body in a single second. Her hand, previously pointing at my face, slowly lowered to her side. She stared at me, her pupils dilating in the dim light of the coat room. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a simple, white envelope. I did not open it. I simply held it between my index and middle finger. The primary trust account, Vivian. I continued keeping my tone conversational, but razor sharp. The one holding the liquid assets for your personal living expenses. It seems there was a catastrophic clerical error. The Internal Revenue Service filed a highly classified tax lien against that specific account on Thursday. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving a sickly, translucent pallor. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing against her diamond choker. She tried to formulate a denial, tried to reassert her dominance, but the words died in her throat. The sheer impossibility of my knowledge paralyzed her. Tax liens on private trusts are heavily guarded secrets, accessible only to federal auditors and the highest tier of institutional creditors. How do you know that Vivian choked out, taking a physical step backward until her spine hit the cedar-paneled wall? You are a clerk. You file patient records. Who told you about the trust? I smiled, a slow, chilling curvature of the lips that signaled absolute devastation. You should really check your balances before you threaten to bury anyone, Mother, I advised softly. I hear the country club is very strict about delinquent membership dues. I did not hand her the envelope. I slipped it back into my pocket. I turned my back on the hyperventilating matriarch of the Mitchell family, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain and stepping back into the bright golden light of the dining room. I left Vivian trapped in the dim coat room, drowning in the sudden realization that her impenetrable shield was constructed of paper-thin lies. The psychological warfare had shifted. The predator was now bleeding. I walked smoothly across the patterned carpet, heading back toward the table where Richard Sterling was holding court. The ambient noise of clinking silver and curated laughter returned. As I approached the center of the room, my gaze caught a disturbance near the grand bar. Harper was standing beside a towering ice sculpture, surrounded by a group of local real estate wives. She was trying to settle a massive, catered champagne tab, waving a black titanium card with theatrical annoyance. A young, flustered waiter in a crisp white shirt held a portable payment terminal, his face flushed with extreme discomfort. "I am sorry, Mrs. Mitchell." The waiter stammered, his voice carrying slightly over the nearby conversation. "The terminal is returning a severe error code. The card is declining." Harper snatched the card back, her face flushing crimson. "That is impossible," she snapped, her voice pitching upward in panic. "Run it again. Run it manually. It is a premium platinum account. There are no limits on that card." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold from a distance. I took a slow, deliberate sip from a glass of sparkling water resting on a passing tray. The waiter swiped the card a second time. The terminal emitted a sharp, negative beep. "It is coming back, completely frozen, ma'am." The waiter whispered, looking around nervously as the surrounding elites began to fall silent, their eyes tracking the unfolding humiliation. "The authorization center says the primary institutional accounts have been locked by the creditor." Harper stared at the terminal as if it were a live grenade. The smug, curated facade she had worn at the grocery store shattered into a million jagged pieces. The whispers began rippling through the country club like wildfire. The queen of the produce aisle was publicly unable to pay for her own drinks. The Vanguard asset freeze had officially breached the perimeter. The invisible guillotine had dropped, and the blood was beginning to show. The sharp negative beep of the portable payment terminal echoed a third time, cutting through the refined murmur of the country club dining room like a siren. Harper stared at the small digital screen, her mouth hanging slightly open. The heavy platinum card trembled between her manicured fingers. The cluster of real estate wives surrounding her, women who had spent the last hour hanging on her every word about custom ski chalets and private flights, took synchronized, subtle steps backward. The social contagion of financial ruin was palpable. Nobody wanted to stand too close to a sinking ship. "Run it again," Harper hissed, her voice cracking as the pitch rose in sheer panic. Her curated elegance dissolved into frantic desperation. She grabbed the young waiter by his crisp white sleeve, her acrylic nails digging into the fabric. "The bank made a mistake. Call the authorization center right now. Tell them it is Harper Mitchell. Tell them who my husband is." "Ma'am, please," the waiter pleaded, trying to gently pry his arm from her grip. "The message is not an error code. The terminal explicitly states the master accounts are seized by a primary creditor. I cannot override a hard freeze." The whispered gossip escalated into an audible hum across the room. Eyes darted toward the ice sculpture, analyzing the spectacular public humiliation of the logistics empire's golden daughter-in-law. Harper released the waiter and practically lunged for her designer handbag resting on the bar. She pulled out her gold-plated smartphone, her thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen. She pressed the device to her ear, her chest heaving visibly beneath her silk blouse. "Preston, pick up the phone," she muttered, frantically pacing a tight circle near the champagne fountain. "Pick up the damn phone, Preston." The call went straight to voicemail. She pulled the phone away, staring at the screen as if it had betrayed her. She dialed again, another immediate diversion to voicemail. The invisible shield of her wealth, the armor she used to belittle anyone she deemed beneath her, was gone. She was entirely exposed. From my vantage point near the center of the dining room, I watched the meltdown with complete clinical detachment. I took another slow, measured sip of my sparkling water. The carbonation burned pleasantly against the back of my throat. The Vanguard protocol was executing flawlessly. The secondary debt markets had processed the ownership transfer, triggering automated lockouts on all cross-collateralized retail accounts. The Mitchell family could no longer access a single dime of their supposed fortune. Harper spun around, her wild, bloodshot eyes, scanning the room for a lifeline or a scapegoat. Her gaze locked onto me. I did not avert my eyes. I held her stare, offering a blank, uncompromising expression. The panic in her eyes instantly mutated into defensive rage. She needed an immediate target to deflect the humiliation radiating from the surrounding tables. She marched across the patterned carpet, her designer heels sinking heavily with each furious stride. The crowd parted for her, eager to watch the impending collision. She stopped inches from my face, thrusting her platinum card forward like a weapon.
"What did you do?" Harper snarled, her voice vibrating with hysterical anger. She did not bother to lower her volume. "Did you do this? Did you hack the bank accounts? I know you work with computers at that pathetic little clinic. You locked my cards out of spite because Preston kicked you out of the guest house." I looked at the piece of frozen plastic trembling in her hand. The sheer absurdity of her accusation highlighted the profound depth of her ignorance. She genuinely believed a rural data analyst possessed the technological capability to seize commercial holding accounts. She could not comprehend the macroeconomic reality crashing down upon her. "I did not hack anything, Harper," I replied, my voice steady, smooth, and deliberately pitched to carry to the tables occupied by the local elite. "I merely pay attention to the math." She let out a harsh, disbelieving scoff, tossing her hair back. "Do not lie to me. Turn the cards back on right now, or I swear to God I will have Preston bury you in so much legal debt you will never recover." I tilted my head, studying her flushed face. "It is fascinating how blindly you trust a man who lies to you every single morning," I stated, stepping slightly closer, invading her space. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her bravado faltering for a microscopic second. "I am talking about the fact that your husband has not deposited a legitimate corporate paycheck into your joint checking account in 6 months. I declared, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. "Mitchell Logistics is utterly insolvent, Harper. The company is bleeding cash. The fleet is leveraged to the breaking point. The platinum card you are holding is anchored to a sinking ship. The bank froze your assets because your husband defaulted on massive commercial loans, not because I typed a few lines of code." The ambient noise in the dining room vanished entirely. The Wisconsin elites absorbed the devastating revelation, silently cataloging the impending bankruptcy of a foundational local family. The social execution was absolute. "You are lying," Harper shrieked, taking a physical step backward, her hands flying to cover her ears, as if she could block out the truth. "Preston is the chief financial officer. He just pulled $3 million for our chalet. You are just a jealous, bitter squatter, making up stories because you got disinherited." I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp curvature of the lips. The $3 million Preston pulled did not belong to him. I countered, refusing to let her retreat into her delusions. He siphoned that capital directly from protected client escrow reserves. Your husband is an embezzler, Harper. He is floating your lavish lifestyle on stolen money, and the primary creditors just shut off the faucet. Tears of pure, selfish terror welled up in her eyes, spilling over her expensive mascara and slicing tracks down her cheeks. The reality of her situation pierced her curated bubble. She was not just broke. She was married to a felon. The designer clothes, the luxury cars, the country club status, it was all funded by federal wire fraud. "I will call the police," Harper sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "I will have you arrested for harassment and defamation. You cannot say these things about us in public. You are ruining my life." I stood my ground, entirely unbothered by her hollow threats. "Call them," I suggested mildly. "I am sure the federal auditors would love to have a detailed conversation with you regarding where the stolen escrow funds were routed. Make sure you mention the Vale Chalet." Harper choked on a ragged sob. She looked wildly around the room, searching for a sympathetic face among her peers. She found only averted gazes and cold, judgmental stares. She dropped the platinum card. It clattered against the hardwood border of the carpet. She turned and fled, pushing past a group of stunned developers, sprinting toward the exit, with her hands covering her face. I watched her run, feeling absolutely nothing. The enabler was broken. The golden daughter-in-law had been stripped of her armor.
A sharp, sustained vibration buzzed against my hip. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out the encrypted Vanguard device. A high-priority text message from Julian illuminated the screen. I opened the secure channel, scanning the brief, densely packed intelligence report. The forensic audit team had successfully infiltrated the Mitchell Logistics servers. They had isolated the exact routing numbers, timestamps, and dummy corporate accounts Preston used to funnel the stolen escrow capital. The digital paper trail was undeniable, verified, and safely secured on Vanguard's off-site servers. We possessed the smoking gun. But the final line of Julian's message triggered a surge of cold, focused adrenaline. "Preston is panicking," Julian wrote. "He just issued a mandatory summons for the entire senior board of directors. He scheduled an emergency executive meeting at the Milwaukee headquarters for 2 o'clock this afternoon. He is attempting to cover up the missing $3 million before the mysterious Vanguard investors arrive for the proposed bailout. He thinks he can hide the theft." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Preston believed he was running out the clock, scrambling to patch a leaking dam before the floodwaters hit. He assumed Vanguard Holdings was a faceless corporate entity, an anonymous savior he could dazzle with manipulated spreadsheets and false projections. He thought he controlled the narrative inside his own boardroom. He had no idea that the executioner was already inside the building. I turned away from the discarded platinum card resting on the floor. I walked calmly toward the grand entrance of the country club, leaving the whispering elite behind to dissect the ruins of the Mitchell family reputation. The domestic skirmishes were over. The psychological warfare had succeeded in fracturing their alliance and exposing their vulnerabilities. It was time to shift the battlefield to the corporate arena. I stepped out into the freezing Wisconsin afternoon, the biting wind whipping my blazer around my waist. I walked to my car, my mind shifting gears, focusing entirely on the impending slaughter. Preston wanted a boardroom meeting with Vanguard Holdings. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. The only question remaining was how violently his fragile reality would shatter when he realized the sister he threw away was the CEO holding the matches. The drive from Lake Geneva to downtown Milwaukee offered an hour of uninterrupted silence. The Wisconsin sky bruised a deep, unforgiving purple, with incoming snow mirroring the corporate storm I was about to unleash. I parked my unassuming sedan in the visitor lot of the Mitchell Logistics headquarters. The sprawling glass and steel structure stood as my father's crowning achievement, a towering monument to regional freight and supply chain dominance. For decades, it represented the impenetrable fortress of my family's wealth. Today, it would become his golden son's professional tomb. I rode the private executive elevator to the top floor. Julian Sterling stood waiting in the plush, carpeted lobby. He held a thick, black binder tucked under his arm. He offered a crisp, silent nod. Together we walked toward the heavy mahogany doors of the primary boardroom. Through the frosted glass panels, the muffled, frantic cadence of my brother's voice leaked into the quiet hallway. Inside the room, Preston paced the length of the long glass table like a hunted animal. The golden boy who had coasted through his 20s on our father's coattails, leaving a trail of wrecked sports cars and hushed scandals, was finally facing a deficit he could not charm his way out of. Preston had inherited the chief financial officer title without knowing how to properly read a balance sheet. He spent his career relying on overworked underlings while he secured tea times at exclusive country clubs. This was the very first time in his life he operated without a safety net, and the pressure was visibly breaking him apart. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit, but the expensive fabric clung awkwardly to his damp shoulders. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the harsh fluorescent lighting. His silk tie hung loose around his unbuttoned collar. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. 7 senior directors sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs. These were seasoned supply chain veterans, men and women who understood the grim reality of defaulting loans and federal oversight. They stared at Preston with a mixture of profound shock and rising terror. "We liquidate the Lake Geneva estate today," Preston pleaded, his voice cracking under the intense strain. He rested his trembling hands on the glass surface, leaning toward the silent board members with wild, bloodshot eyes. The residential market is booming. We bypass the standard appraisal process, accept a rapid cash offer, and inject those funds directly back into the client escrow accounts before the federal auditors notice the liquidity gap. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the room. Preston was not just pitching a real estate sale, he was openly asking his senior directors to become complicit in covering up his felony embezzlement. It is a temporary float. Preston insisted, wiping his wet brow with the back of his sleeve. He paced away from the table, his leather shoes squeaking sharply against the hardwood floor. We just need to survive the next 2 hours. Listen to me. Vanguard Holdings is sending their chief executive officer to this very room today. They are a profound Chicago equity firm looking to expand their footprint into regional freight. They want to inject substantial capital into our operations. Preston stopped pacing, forcing a desperate, hollow smile. We secure their investment, replace the missing $3 million, and nobody goes to prison. We smile. We shake their hands. And we let Vanguard save this company. He genuinely believed his own desperate fiction. He thought he could dazzle a private equity titan with manipulated ledgers and a forced, charismatic grin. He assumed Vanguard Holdings was a faceless entity, an anonymous savior he could manipulate, just like he manipulated our father. He had no concept of the lethal trap waiting just outside his door. I reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The brass hinges swung silently, but the sudden shift in air pressure drew the immediate attention of every director in the room. Preston turned toward the entrance, plastering a welcoming, eager expression across his flushed face. He expected a powerful corporate savior to walk through the frame. He expected salvation. Instead, he saw the sister he had discarded. I did not wear the faded beige sweater from the law office. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal blazer, my posture rigid and commanding. Julian followed closely behind me. His demeanor shifted from the neutral estate lawyer to a lethal corporate proxy. The visual impact struck the room like a physical blow. The senior directors exchanged bewildered glances, their minds struggling to process the sudden intrusion. Preston blinked rapidly. His brain fractured as it tried to reconcile the visual data with his expectations. The welcoming smile melted into a look of profound confusion, followed swiftly by defensive, arrogant rage. He let out a harsh, nervous laugh, glancing at his terrified board members to ensure they shared the joke. "Adina, what are you doing here?" Preston snapped, his voice tight and dripping with rehearsed condescension. "This is a restricted executive floor. You need to leave right now. We are expecting highly important investors." I did not stop walking. I crossed the threshold, my heels clicking a steady, unyielding rhythm against the floorboards. I kept my gaze locked entirely on his sweating, panicked face. I said, "Get out." Preston shouted, the lingering remnants of his patriarchal authority crumbling into a hysterical pitch. He reached for the intercom button on the center console of the table. "Security, I need an unstable individual removed from the boardroom immediately. Send a guard to the top floor." I did not flinch. Julian stepped forward, smoothly bypassing my brother. He placed the thick, black Vanguard binder onto the center of the glass table. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room, a definitive sound that commanded absolute attention. I walked past Preston, ignoring his outstretched, trembling hand. I pulled out the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the chief executive officer. I sat down, folding my hands neatly over the pristine glass surface. "Security works for me now, Preston." The room felt as though the oxygen had been siphoned through the overhead ventilation grates. Preston stared at the small plastic intercom speaker embedded in the polished mahogany rim of the table. He stabbed the button a second time, his index finger turning white from the pressure. Only a faint, hollow hiss responded. The Vanguard acquisition had already triggered internal security protocols. The building's infrastructure recognized a new hierarchy. The 7 senior directors sat rigid in their high-backed leather chairs. Their eyes darted nervously between my tailored charcoal blazer and the sweating, frantic man standing near the entrance. These were seasoned corporate veterans, individuals who had survived decades of supply chain fluctuations and economic downturns. Yet they were currently witnessing a power inversion they could not comprehend. The outcast sister, the supposed rural clinic employee, was now dictating terms inside their fortified sanctuary. I reached out and flipped open the thick cover of the black binder. The crisp white pages offered a stark visual contrast to the dark wood and reflective glass. I did not raise my voice or attempt to match my brother's frantic, high-pitched energy. True authority requires no volume. I scanned the first page, reading the forensic accounting summary compiled by my auditors just hours prior. On Tuesday at 1400 hours, I began my tone carrying the detached clinical cadence of a surgeon evaluating a terminal scan. A wire transfer was initiated from the primary client escrow account. I recited the 16-digit routing sequence, letting the numbers hang in the stagnant air. The capital traveled through a Delaware shell corporation before terminating in a private real estate trust based in Colorado. The exact sum transferred was $3 million. The designated property is a 5-bedroom ski chalet in Vail. Preston opened his mouth, attempting to form a coherent denial. That is an internal error. He stammered, his voice thin and unconvincing. We were moving capital to cover a temporary logistical shortfall. You are misinterpreting standard corporate procedures. You have no business training, Adana. You do not understand these ledgers. I understand the commercial escrow accounts contain legally protected client funds, I countered smoothly, turning to the second page of the audit. I also understand that utilizing those specific funds for personal real estate ventures constitutes federal embezzlement. The digital paper trail is undeniable. We secured the timestamps, the IP addresses, and your personal authorization codes. You left a digital fingerprint on every stolen dollar. He stopped breathing. His lips grew dry and cracked, hanging slightly open. The residual color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving a pallor reminiscent of wet cement. The expensive cologne he wore mixed with the sharp, acrid scent of raw fear. For his entire life, whenever he shattered a luxury vehicle or failed a crucial university exam, our father had quietly written a check to erase the consequence. Preston grew up believing accountability was meant solely for the working class. He operated under the delusion that his surname provided an impenetrable shield. Now, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of his own boardroom, there was no patriarch left to rescue him. The oldest director at the table, a stern woman who managed the eastern freight routes, leaned away from Preston as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. Embezzlement was not a simple accounting error. It was a felony, carrying mandatory prison sentences and catastrophic regulatory fines. Preston recognized the subtle shift in the room. The executives who previously tolerated his ineptitude were now actively distancing themselves from his radioactive presence. His survival instinct faltered, plunging him into an abyss of panic. His knees buckled. He dropped heavily into the nearest leather seat, his spine slouching. The polished air dissolved into a puddle of desperation. Tears spilled over his lower lids, tracking through the fine layer of sweat coating his face. "Adana, please." He choked out a ragged, wet sob tearing through his throat. "You cannot do this to me. The business media will run the story. The regulators will seize my assets. Harper will leave me the second she finds out I have no money. Just give me one day. Let me fix the ledger. I will secure a private loan and replace every single penny before the auditors return. I am your brother. We share the same blood." I studied his weeping form. He offered zero remorse for stealing the funds, exhibiting only a pathetic terror of enduring the impending social and financial humiliation. He expected blood ties to override his spectacular greed, conveniently forgetting how quickly he discarded those same ties when he ordered me out of the guest house. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against a folded, slightly stiff piece of paper. I withdrew the slip and placed it flat upon the smooth glass. It was the exact check he had tossed at me during the will reading, still bearing the faint brown stain of a coffee cup ring. I pressed my index finger against the paper and slid it forward. It glided effortlessly, stopping mere inches from his trembling, tear-stained hands. "For the U-Haul," I whispered. The heavy double doors swung open behind him. 2 uniformed security guards stepped inside, their faces impassive. They flanked Preston, grasping him firmly by the upper arms. He lacked the spine to resist. He did not fight or shout, his expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly across the patterned carpet as they hauled his limp, sobbing frame backward, pulling him out of the executive suite forever. The doors clicked shut, severing the dead branch from the family tree. The silence returned to the boardroom, dense and expectant. The remaining directors sat frozen, awaiting their fate. I ignored them, turning my attention back to the open binder. Julian leaned over my shoulder, flipping past the audit summaries toward the final appendix. "There is an additional layer of exposure you need to see," Julian murmured, keeping his tone restricted to my ear alone. I looked down at the highlighted document. It was a secondary promissory note issued 6 months prior, leveraging a $5 million line of credit against the Lake Geneva estate. The collateralization was severe enough to sink the property entirely. But the financial burden was not the most intriguing aspect of the paperwork. The signature line drew my intense focus. The ink did not bear my father's familiar scrawl, nor did it contain Vivian's elegant, sweeping cursive. The guarantor's signature belonged to Harper. My analytical mind processed the profound implications. Preston had not merely stolen from his logistics clients. He had secretly forged his own wife's identity to secure illicit capital anchoring her pristine credit to his toxic fraud. Harper currently believed she was the untouchable queen of the country club, oblivious to the reality that her name was tethered to a defaulted $5 million loan. The impending fallout would not just ruin my brother, it would tear the remaining family alliance to shreds from the inside out. The drive from the corporate headquarters back to my own neighborhood offered a sharp visual descent, from towering glass high-rises to weathered brick walk-ups. I lived on the 4th floor of a nondescript building in a working-class Milwaukee district. The heating pipes rattled a steady metallic rhythm, and the hallway always carried a faint scent of industrial floor cleaner. I possessed the liquid capital to purchase a penthouse overlooking the lake, in cash, but maintaining a camouflage of poverty remained a vital tactical advantage. Predators rarely inspect the shadows. I had barely hung my tailored charcoal blazer in the narrow closet when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed against my front door. I did not anticipate visitors. I walked softly across the scuffed linoleum floor and peered through the brass peephole. Standing in the dim corridor was the matriarch of the Mitchell family. Vivian wore a pristine cream cashmere coat, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, looking entirely out of place against the peeling paint of the hallway. She held a woven wicker basket covered by a checkered linen napkin. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Adana, darling," Vivian breathed, her voice carrying a carefully calibrated flutter of exhaustion. She pushed past me, entering the small living space without waiting for an invitation. She set the wicker basket onto the edge of my laminate kitchen counter. The rich, buttery aroma of artisanal croissants and imported fruit preserves drifted into the stale apartment air. It was a classic manipulation tactic. Feed the target, soften their defenses with unearned warmth, and then extract the desired concession. It took me hours to find this address. Vivian sighed, pressing a gloved hand against her chest, as if her heart were failing. She surveyed the cramped dimensions of my living room, her upper lip curling in a brief, involuntary sneer, before she forced a look of maternal sorrow back onto her face. "It breaks my soul to see you living in such squalor. You always were so stubbornly independent, refusing our help." I leaned against the doorframe, watching her performance with quiet fascination. 10 years ago, she had watched me pack a single suitcase in the freezing rain without shedding a single tear. Now she was attempting to play the devastated, loving mother. "Why are you here, Vivian?" I asked, my tone flat and devoid of any reciprocal warmth. She removed her leather gloves, laying them neatly beside the pastry basket. "The family is experiencing a profound crisis, Edina. Preston was terminated this afternoon." She paused, waiting for me to act surprised. I simply offered a slow, measured blink. "The new corporate owners at Vanguard Holdings are ruthlessly dismantling your father's legacy." Vivian continued, her voice trembling with practiced frailty. "Your brother is a foolish boy. He made severe errors in judgment trying to navigate immense operational pressure. He was merely trying to keep the logistics firm afloat. Felony embezzlement from protected client escrow accounts is not a mere error in judgment," I corrected smoothly. "It requires a deliberate, daily sequence of calculated theft." Vivian flinched. Her jaw tightened, the tendons in her neck straining against her pearl choker. She despised being contradicted, especially by the daughter she deemed intellectually inferior. She quickly recovered, offering a heavy, tragic sigh. "We cannot change the past," she murmured, walking toward the center of my small living room. "The authorities are investigating Preston, and the company is gone. All we have left is the Lake Geneva estate. It is the final piece of our heritage. We need to sell the property immediately to secure a legal defense fund for your brother and ensure I have a stable retirement." She reached into the deep pocket of her cashmere coat and withdrew a crisp manila envelope. She placed it onto the narrow coffee table. "You occupy the guest house on the property grounds," Vivian stated, her tone shifting from mourning mother to transactional negotiator. "Your physical presence and your potential claims against the will create a clouded title. No legitimate buyer will close on the estate while you reside there. We need a clean break." I looked at the envelope. "What are you proposing?" "Inside that folder is a formal quitclaim deed," Vivian explained, her eyes fixed intently on my face. "By signing it, you legally renounce any inherited interest in the Lake Geneva estate. In exchange, I have included a certified cashier check for $10,000. She smiled a thin, patronizing expression. $10,000 is a life-changing sum for someone in your position. You can upgrade this dreadful apartment. You can buy a reliable vehicle. You can start over somewhere new, far away from all this family trauma. We want to see you thrive, Adana. We truly do." I studied the woman standing in my living room. She was offering me a fraction of a percent of an estate valued at nearly $8 million. She believed my poverty was so desperate and my self-worth so low that I would eagerly accept pennies to escape her presence. She still viewed me as the frightened 23-year-old she had discarded in the sleet. I did not walk toward the coffee table. I kept my arms folded across my chest. $10,000 is a very specific number. I noted, my voice chillingly calm. It is just low enough to avoid mandatory reporting to the Internal Revenue Service. You are trying to buy my silence using untraceable cash. Vivian stiffened her posture, snapping rigid. "Do not be ungrateful. It is a generous settlement." "It is a bribe," I countered, dissecting her narrative with surgical precision. "And it reveals exactly how complicit you are in this entire disaster. You knew about Preston failing ledgers months ago. You knew he was siphoning funds. Yet you continued to host lavish country club luncheons and purchase imported luxury goods. You enabled his theft because your primary concern has always been maintaining your elevated social status. You do not care if your son goes to federal prison as long as you get to keep your country club membership." The manufactured maternal warmth evaporated instantly. The illusion of the fragile, grieving widow shattered, replaced by the venomous predator lurking underneath. The air in the room grew dense and hostile. "You insolent, ungrateful little wretch," Vivian snarled, her voice dropping into a harsh, rasping register, her lips thinned into a bloodless line. "I am offering you a singular opportunity to walk away with something rather than nothing. If you refuse this check, I will ensure you are entirely ruined." She snatched her leather gloves from the kitchen counter, her hands shaking with genuine, unfiltered fury. "You think you are so clever sitting in this pathetic box," she hissed, marching toward the front door. "I retained a new litigator this afternoon, Marcus Thorne. He is the most ruthless probate attorney in the state. He specializes in extracting tumors like you. We are scheduled for a formal mediation tomorrow morning." She stopped inches from my face, her eyes blazing with spite. "If you do not sign that deed today, I will walk into that mediation room and swear under oath that you systematically vandalized the guest house." Vivian promised, leaning closer. "I will present fabricated invoices proving you caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage. I will file formal charges for elder abuse, claiming you manipulated your dying father to steal his assets. Thorne will freeze your bank accounts, garnish your meager wages, and drag your name through the mud until you cannot even secure a job sweeping floors. You will leave that mediation room destitute and facing a criminal record. I held my ground, allowing her toxic breath to wash over me. She was so supremely confident in her ability to manipulate the legal system. She believed a high-priced shark lawyer and a few rehearsed tears could bend reality to her will. "I am looking forward to it," I replied softly. Vivian glared at me, her chest heaving. She reached for the brass doorknob, pulling the heavy door open. "We will see how brave you are tomorrow when Thorne destroys you," she spat. She stepped out into the dingy hallway, the heels of her designer boots striking the linoleum like hammer blows. She did not look back. I closed the door, listening to her fading footsteps until the stairwell fell silent once more. I turned and looked at the wicker basket of pastries sitting on my counter. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. Vivian had just shown her hand. She intended to walk into a recorded legal proceeding and deliver sworn testimony to frame me. She believed her lies were her greatest weapon. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that her impending perjury was the exact bait Julian and I needed to close the steel jaws of our final trap. The mediation suite on the 22nd floor of a downtown legal firm felt like a sterile glass box designed for bloodless combat. Frosted partitions blocked the outside world, trapping the tense atmosphere inside. The room smelled faintly of dry erase markers and the ozone hum of the overhead ventilation system. A long, polished oak table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by stiff, ergonomic chairs that discouraged any physical comfort. At the head of the table sat a court-appointed mediator. He was a quiet, unassuming man whose sole purpose was to document the proceedings. He pressed a button on a sleek digital audio recorder resting in the center of the wood. A small crimson light began to pulse, signaling that every spoken word was now a matter of permanent legal record. My mother Vivian sat across from me. She wore a tailored navy dress adorned with a single string of authentic pearls. She projected the pristine image of an untouchable matriarch, her posture rigid and her chin lifted in defiance. She believed she had orchestrated the perfect ambush. Beside Vivian sat Marcus Thorne. He was a notorious probate litigator known throughout Wisconsin for extracting immense concessions through sheer attrition. He wore a pristine silver-gray suit, and a platinum watch glinted on his wrist every time he moved. He did not offer a polite greeting. He skipped the standard introductions entirely, relying on a predatory stare to unsettle his opponents. Thorne unlatched his designer briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. He tossed it onto the oak surface. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet room. Julian Sterling, sitting to my left, flinched. He fumbled with his cheap plastic pen, dropping it onto the floor. It rolled under the table, forcing Julian to bend over awkwardly to retrieve it. My lawyer wore a rumpled tweed jacket that looked as though it had survived a moth infestation. His tie was faded and crooked. He appeared entirely out of his depth, resembling a burnt-out public defender who had forgotten to review his case file. "We are not here to negotiate a trivial family dispute," Thorne began, his tone dripping with polished extortion. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward to claim the physical space. "My client has suffered severe financial injury due to the destructive and erratic actions of your client." Thorne flipped the folder open. He spread a fan of high-resolution photographs and printed contracting invoices across the wood. When Adonna Mitchell was asked to vacate the guest house, she engaged in a retaliatory campaign of vandalism. Thorne stated, locking his cold gaze onto me. She smashed vintage porcelain fixtures. She tore holes in the imported drywall. She poured quick-drying cement down the primary plumbing lines. I hold here certified estimates detailing $100,000 in deliberate property damage. I looked down at the glossy photographs scattered near my folded hands. They displayed a ruined bathroom, shattered mirrors, and debris strewn across a hardwood floor. It was a masterful fabrication. On the night I left the estate 10 years ago, I had scrubbed the guest house baseboards until my knuckles bled, leaving the property in immaculate condition. Vivian had clearly hired a demolition crew to trash her own secondary building just to manufacture a weapon against me. "We are prepared to file a sweeping civil suit by the close of business today," Thorne continued, tapping a manicured finger against the stack of invoices. "Furthermore, we will submit these findings to the county prosecutor to pursue criminal mischief charges. We are also preparing a secondary filing for elder abuse, detailing how your client manipulated a dying man to stay on the property. Adana will face jail time and a civil judgment that will garnish her wages for the next 2 decades.
Vivian sat back in her chair, steepling her fingers. A smug, triumphant grin spread across her face. She watched me intently, waiting for the panic to set in. She expected the rural clinic employee to shatter under the threat of a 6-figure lawsuit and a criminal record. She wanted to see me weep. I kept my breathing steady. I did not blink. I merely observed the pulsing crimson light of the digital recorder. However, my client is a generous woman, Thorne said, his voice softening into a feigned register of compromise. She wishes to avoid the public spectacle of sending her own daughter to prison. We will bury these invoices. We will drop the elder abuse investigation entirely. In exchange, Adana will sign a permanent quitclaim deed right now, surrendering any and all inherited interest in the Lake Geneva estate. It was a beautifully constructed trap. They had cornered me with forged evidence, demanding I surrender my rightful legacy in exchange for my freedom. They believed their high-priced legal talent had terrified us into submission. I turned my head slightly, watching Julian react. Julian played his part flawlessly. He blinked rapidly, wiping his forehead with the back of his tweed sleeve. He scrambled to gather his loose, coffee-stained papers, knocking a stack of sticky notes onto the floor. He stammered, offering a portrait of a cheap lawyer drowning in very deep water. "Hold on a moment," Julian mumbled, adjusting his crooked, wire-rimmed glasses. "This is a highly irregular development. I need to review these specific allegations. My client maintains she left the premises in perfect condition. We were not prepared for criminal threats today." Thorne rolled his eyes, letting out a harsh, theatrical scoff. "The photographs speak for themselves, counselor. You can review them in a holding cell if you prefer. My client has offered a generous lifeline. I suggest you advise her to take it before I call the prosecutor." Julian held up a trembling hand, his face flushed with manufactured anxiety. "Let us just get the facts straight for the record." He gestured toward the silent mediator. The mediator nodded, confirming the digital recorder was capturing every single syllable. The crimson light blinked steadily, an impartial witness to the unfolding drama. "If we are discussing immense property damage and a quitclaim deed," Julian stammered, looking directly at my mother, "I must verify the legal standing of the plaintiff. Vivian, you are claiming damages to a structure located on the primary estate. Just to be thorough for my notes, are you the sole legal owner of this property?" Thorne let out an exasperated sigh, annoyed by the trivial question. "Yes, my client is the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the Mitchell Trust. The estate belongs to her." "I need to hear it from her," Julian insisted, his voice wavering slightly as he scribbled a messy note on his yellow legal pad. "For the official transcript." Vivian leaned forward, eager to assert her dominance over the fumbling man across the table. Her towering ego could not resist the opportunity to boast about her wealth on a recorded legal record. "I own every blade of grass on that estate," Vivian boasted, projecting her voice toward the microphone. "The deed is exclusively held by my trust." Julian nodded slowly, keeping his eyes downcast. "I see. And to ensure there are no other parties who need to be listed on this potential settlement, are there any secondary stakeholders? Does the Lake Geneva estate carry any encumbrances, liens, or secondary mortgages that might complicate the chain of title?" The jaws of the trap sprang wide open, waiting for her to step inside. Vivian was a proud woman, blinded by decades of country club conditioning. To admit she harbored crippling debt in front of a high-priced litigator and a court-appointed mediator was an impossible prospect. She needed to project the illusion of untouchable prosperity. She needed to prove she was a titan. "There are 0 encumbrances on my property," Vivian swore, her tone fierce and unwavering. "I hold the estate free and clear. There is no secondary debt. I am the sole, unencumbered owner of the Mitchell family home." The blinking crimson light of the digital recorder captured the lie, sealing it forever into the permanent legal transcript. Julian stopped scribbling. The nervous trembling in his hands vanished instantly. His slumped shoulders straightened his spine, aligning with rigid military precision. The bumbling public defender persona evaporated into thin air, revealing the lethal, high-tier corporate litigator beneath the faded tweed jacket. He did not look intimidated anymore. He looked
bored. Julian reached down and popped the brass latches of his battered briefcase. He did not pull out a yellow legal pad or a messy stack of sticky notes. He extracted a pristine, heavy folder marked with a bright red tab. He placed it squarely in the center of the polished oak table, right next to the audio recorder. "Thank you for committing perjury, Vivian," Julian stated, his voice dropping into a crisp, lethal cadence that chilled the room. Harper sat perched on a tufted leather sofa positioned near the frosted glass wall of the mediation suite. She had insisted on attending the session. Her presence held no legal utility, but she hungered for the spectacle. She wanted a front-row seat to watch the family outcast beg for mercy. Harper held a porcelain coffee cup, her legs crossed, a cashmere scarf draped perfectly over her shoulders. She had spent the last 20 minutes wearing a smug, satisfied smirk, thoroughly enjoying my presumed execution. That smirk evaporated the moment Julian spoke the word perjury. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Marcus Thorne, the high-priced litigator, froze. His predatory instincts shifted from attacking us to assessing his own sudden exposure. An attorney suborning false testimony on a digital recording risks permanent disbarment. Julian opened the red folder. He bypassed the fabricated vandalism invoices entirely. His fingers extracted a thick, multi-page financial contract bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of an international banking institution. He placed it onto the oak surface and pushed it forward. The paper glided smoothly, stopping precisely in front of my mother. Vivian looked down, her carefully curated composure fractured. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a sickly, chalky hue. Her manicured nails dug into the armrests of her chair. "This is a certified commercial loan agreement," Julian explained, his voice devoid of any previous stutter. "Originated 6 months ago, routing $5 million through an offshore shell company to keep Mitchell Logistics afloat. The collateral securing this illicit debt is the Lake Geneva estate. The same estate you just swore under oath was unencumbered." Thorne leaned over his eyes, scanning the dense legal text. He saw the official stamps. He saw the dates. He looked at his client, his jaw clenching. Vivian had lied to him, leading him directly into a legal minefield. I did not allow Vivian time to formulate a defense. I turned my attention away from the matriarch and focused entirely on the woman sitting on the sofa. "Harper," I said, my tone cool and inviting, "I suggest you put your coffee down and join us at the table." Harper blinked, her brow furrowing. She looked at Vivian, expecting her mother-in-law to shut me down. But Vivian remained paralyzed, staring at the banking document as if it were a venomous snake. Hesitantly, Harper stood up. Her designer boots clicked against the polished floorboards as she closed the distance. She stopped beside Vivian's chair, peering down at the scattered paperwork. "Turn to page 14, I instructed. Look at the bottom right corner. Read the guarantor's signature line out loud." Harper hesitated. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and flipped through the thick stack of paper. The rustling of the pages echoed loudly in the tense silence. She found the designated section. Her eyes traced the blue ink. "That is my name," Harper whispered, her voice barely a breath. "That is my signature, but I never signed a commercial loan. I do not even know what an offshore shell company is." I studied my sister-in-law. Harper grew up in a modest suburban subdivision. She spent her adolescence meticulously guarding her personal finances, ensuring her credit score remained impeccable so she could eventually marry into a higher tax bracket. When she secured Preston, she believed she had crossed the finish line into untouchable prosperity. She traded genuine affection for social status, relying entirely on the Mitchell family name to shield her from consequence. "You did not sign it," I confirmed, delivering the truth with surgical precision. "Your husband and your mother-in-law forged your identity. That is a lie," Vivian snapped, finding a fraction of her voice. She reached for the document, trying to pull it away. "This is a fabricated trick. Adana is manipulating the paperwork." Julian intercepted her hand, placing his palm flat over the signature page. "The ink is verified Vivian. The notary stamp is authentic, purchased through a corrupt clerk who has already surrendered his logs to federal investigators." I kept my gaze fixed on Harper. The smug socialite was experiencing the total collapse of her curated reality. "Preston drained his commercial credit lines months ago," I explained, mapping out the architecture of the fraud for the room to hear. His financial standing became toxic. Vivian's primary trust accounts are locked under federal tax liens. Neither of them possessed the pristine credit required to secure a $5 million lifeline. But you did, Harper. You maintained a flawless financial record. Harper's breath hitched. She looked at Vivian, her eyes wide with mounting terror. You used my name. They needed a clean proxy. I continued refusing to let the tension dissipate. They buried a signature page inside a stack of routine tax documents and told you it was standard estate maintenance. You trusted them. You signed where they pointed. They leveraged your impeccable credit, forged your consent as a primary guarantor, and funneled the cash into unregulated accounts to save their sinking empire. Thorne shifted his weight, his chair scraping backward. He was already calculating his exit strategy. Representing a difficult client was profitable. Representing a client actively engaging in identity theft on tape was professional suicide. It was a temporary measure Vivian choked out, abandoning the denial when the evidence proved undeniable. She looked at Harper, attempting to project a hollow maternal authority. We were protecting the family assets. Preston promised to repay the loan before the quarter ended. We were saving your lifestyle, Harper. You enjoy the country club. You enjoy the designer clothes. Those things require capital. Harper took a physical step backward, recoiling from the older woman. The admission hung in the sterile air of the mediation suite, toxic and irrefutable. You anchored my name to $5 million of debt, Harper gasped, her hands flying to her chest. Preston lost his job yesterday. The bank locked my platinum cards. We do not have any income. It is worse than that, Harper, I stated, dropping the final, devastating anchor. Because Preston defaulted on the loan, the creditors accelerated the terms. The debt is currently in active default. Furthermore, moving illicit funds through offshore shell companies using a forged signature constitutes federal wire fraud. Federal authorities are already investigating the routing numbers. You are not just facing bankruptcy. You are legally tethered to a federal criminal probe. The color vanished entirely from Harper's face. The diamond earrings, the cashmere scarf, the tailored boots, they all became meaningless artifacts attached to a woman who was suddenly and profoundly ruined. She realized that the people she had worshipped, the family she had married into to elevate her own status, viewed her as nothing more than a disposable financial asset. They had led her to the slaughterhouse to buy themselves a few more months of false prosperity. You sacrificed me, Harper whispered, tears of pure, selfish horror spilling over her dark eyelashes. She stared at Vivian, her expression twisting from shock into a mask of feral, unvarnished hatred. We did what was necessary, Vivian hissed, her own panic eroding any remaining pretense of civility. Do not act like a victim. You spent our money faster than we could print it. You are just as complicit in the indulgence. The toxic family alliance fractured. The seamless, unified front they had wielded against me for a decade shattered into jagged pieces right inside the mediation room. I watched them turn their fangs upon each other, the natural consequence of an empire built entirely on greed and deceit. They were no longer focused on evicting me or fabricating property damage. They were suddenly fighting for their own survival, realizing the lifeboat was shrinking and neither of them intended to drown alone. Thorne watched the exchange with the cold calculation of a mercenary. He reached down and snapped the brass latches of his briefcase shut. The metallic click sounded like a judge's gavel. We are concluding this session, Thorne announced, his voice devoid of the predatory swagger he had displayed 20 minutes ago. I cannot represent a client who has provided fraudulent testimony under oath. Consider my representation officially terminated. I will forward my final invoice by messenger. You cannot leave, Vivian ordered, dread bleeding into her tone. We have a signed retainer. You have to fix this. I litigate probate disputes, Vivian Thorne replied, standing up and pulling his suit jacket straight. I do not defend federal identity theft. Good luck. He walked out of the suite, the heavy door closing behind him, leaving Vivian isolated at the long oak table. Harper stood near the exit, her hands trembling so fiercely she could barely hold her leather handbag. The pristine, untouchable reality she had curated for herself was gone. She was going to face federal investigators entirely alone, carrying the crushing weight of a debt she never authorized. Her husband was a felon. Her mother-in-law was a traitor. The golden cage she had fought so hard to enter had just locked its doors, transforming into a prison. She looked at Vivian one last time, her eyes burning with intense loathing. The loyalty was dead. The betrayal was total. Harper pushed the glass door open and stumbled out into the hallway, leaving the shattered remains of the Mitchell dynasty scattered across the table. The heavy glass door of the mediation suite swung shut, muting the sterile hum of the ventilation system. However, the tension did not remain trapped inside the room. It bled out into the expansive marble-floored lobby of the downtown law firm. The reception area was an architectural testament to elite litigation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Milwaukee skyline, while plush leather seating areas invited high-net-worth clients to wait in quiet luxury. Today, the serene atmosphere was about to be obliterated. Harper stumbled out of the suite, her breath coming in ragged, audible gasps. The shock of the $5 million forged loan had paralyzed her inside the room, but the adrenaline was finally breaching the dam. The realization of her total financial ruination crashed through her curated facade. She was not merely losing a ski chalet or suffering a temporary credit freeze. She was permanently shackled to a massive defaulting commercial debt. Her pristine credit score, the very asset she had guarded fiercely since her modest suburban upbringing, had been stolen and destroyed by the people she married to escape her roots. Vivian followed her out a moment later. The matriarch of the Mitchell family walked with a stiff, unnatural gait. Without her shark lawyer to shield her, the confident swagger she possessed 30 minutes ago had vanished. She clutched her designer handbag tight against her chest, her jaw set in a rigid line, projecting a desperate attempt to maintain her dignity in public. She severely underestimated the explosive volatility of a cornered socialite. Harper stopped near a low glass coffee table in the center of the lobby. She turned around, her eyes locking onto her mother-in-law. The mascara she applied so carefully that morning was running in dark tracks down her cheeks. "You stole my identity," Harper screamed. The sound tore through the quiet reception area like a siren. Secretaries paused their typing. Paralegals carrying thick legal files froze mid-stride. Junior partners stepping out of nearby offices stopped to watch the unfolding spectacle. The unspoken code of silent, discreet wealth was shattered by the sheer, unvarnished volume of Harper's fury. Vivian flinched, glancing nervously at the gathering audience. She hurried forward, raising a manicured hand in a frantic hushing gesture. "Keep your voice down, Harper. You are making a scene. We will discuss this in the car. We can fix the paperwork." "Fix it," Harper shrieked, taking a step toward the older woman. "You forged my signature on federal documents. You used my name to hide your bankrupt empire from the auditors. You sold my future to buy yourself another season at the country club. I am facing federal wire fraud charges because of your lies." Harper did not wait for an apology. Her cashmere coat slipped off her shoulders, hitting the marble floor as she lunged. She did not throw a punch, but she grabbed Vivian by the lapels of her tailored navy dress. The physical contact breached every rule of high society etiquette Vivian had spent a lifetime observing. Harper shook the older woman, her acrylic nails digging into the expensive fabric. "You ruined my life." Harper wailed, her voice cracking under the emotional strain. "I have nothing left. The bank locked my accounts. The car is probably gone. I am tied to $5 million of toxic debt, and it is entirely your fault." Vivian stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the polished marble. The pristine image of the untouchable matriarch dissolved completely. She was no longer the Queen of Lake Geneva. She was a desperate, drowning fraud being physically assaulted by her own daughter-in-law in a public lobby. "Get your hands off me, you hysterical brat." Vivian snarled, her own panic mutating into defensive rage. She shoved Harper away with surprising force. Harper stumbled, hitting the edge of the glass coffee table before catching her balance. Do not play the victim with me, Vivian hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the younger woman. You spent our money faster than we could steal it. You demanded the luxury vehicles. You demanded the international vacations. You demanded the status. You were perfectly happy to swipe the platinum cards without ever asking where the cash originated. You are a parasite who married my son for his last name, and now you want to cry because the bill is finally due. The vicious truth hung in the air. A toxic admission, confirming the moral bankruptcy of the entire Mitchell dynasty. They were both parasites, feeding off an illusion of wealth, completely willing to sacrifice each other the moment the host body expired. The soft melodic chime of the main lobby elevator echoed through the reception area. The metal doors slid open. Preston stepped out onto the executive floor. The golden boy of the Mitchell family looked like a ghost hauling his own corpse. He wore the same custom suit from the corporate boardroom yesterday, but it was deeply wrinkled and smelled of stale sweat. His tie was missing. Dark, bruised circles shadowed his bloodshot eyes. Following his termination and the freezing of his assets, he had likely spent the night sitting in a cold car, unable to access a hotel room, and too terrified to face his wife. He had come to the law firm seeking his mother, desperate for a legal lifeline or a secret cash reserve. He walked into the lobby and stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the chaotic scene unfolding near the coffee table. He saw his mother breathing heavily, her dress rumpled. He saw his wife weeping hysterically, her designer coat discarded on the floor. Preston Harper gasped, her eyes locking onto her husband. The betrayal reignited her fury, fueling a fresh wave of adrenaline. She marched across the marble floor, closing the distance in 3 rapid strides. Preston opened his mouth, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Harper, please, I can explain everything. I was under immense pressure at the firm." He did not get the chance to deliver his prepared excuses. Harper swung her right arm back and slapped him across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp, resonant crack echoed across the vast reception area. Preston's head snapped to the side. He staggered backward, hitting the polished wall near the elevator bank. A bright red welt instantly materialized across his pale cheek. He touched his face, staring at his wife in stunned silence. "Explain what Harper screamed, her voice hoarse and raw. Explain how you lost your job. Explain how you embezzled client funds. Explain how you let your mother forge my signature to secure a $5 million offshore loan. You are a coward, Preston. You are a pathetic, broke coward." I stepped out of the mediation suite, Julian walking quietly beside me. We stood near the doorway, observing the spectacular cannibalization of the family alliance. The unified front they had maintained for decades, the arrogant shield they used to discard me into the cold, had imploded completely. They were tearing each other apart in front of 50 witnesses, consumed by the exact toxic greed they had worshipped their entire lives. I did not feel a rush of vindictive joy. I felt the profound, abiding calm of a mathematical equation finally balancing itself out. The parasites had consumed the host, and now they were turning their fangs upon one another. "I am filing for divorce today," Harper sobbed, backing away from her husband. She bent down, snatching her cashmere coat off the marble floor. "Do not ever speak to me again. I am taking whatever is left." She turned and fled, pushing past a group of stunned paralegals. She practically ran toward the stairwell, desperate to escape the building and the suffocating reality of her ruined marriage. Preston remained slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at Vivian, pleading for maternal comfort, searching for the unconditional bailout she had provided his entire life. "Mom, please," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "The regulators are pulling my passport. I need access to the secondary trust accounts. I need cash to retain a defense attorney." Vivian stared at her broken son. The maternal warmth was entirely absent. She looked at him not with love, but with cold, calculating self-preservation. He was no longer the golden heir. He was a massive liability dragging federal investigators to her doorstep. "The trust accounts are frozen," Preston Vivian replied, her tone flat and devoid of empathy. "You brought this disaster upon us. You failed to manage the company. You let the auditors inside the network. You are entirely on your own." She turned her back on him, refusing to offer a single shred of comfort. The matriarch abandoned her prized creation the moment his utility expired. Vivian adjusted the strap of her handbag and walked briskly toward the opposite end of the lobby, ignoring the staring audience. She was cornered, stripped of her legal counsel, her son, and her social standing. But a narcissist rarely accepts absolute defeat gracefully. When the illusion shatters, they cling desperately to the final scraps of power they possess. I watched her walk away, analyzing her posture. She was heading toward the county courthouse down the street. She still believed she held one final card to play. She intended to drain whatever secret, untraceable cash reserve she possessed to hire a desperate litigator. She planned to file an emergency injunction, hoping to sway a judge with theatrical tears and fabricated tales of elder abuse. She believed she could still evict me from the Lake Geneva estate and secure a rapid sale to save herself. She had no idea that the courtroom was the exact location I had chosen for her final execution. The perjury trap was set. The forged documents were authenticated, and the Vanguard ledgers were primed to drop like an anvil. She was walking willingly into the final slaughter. The heavy oak doors of the Walworth County Probate Court sealed shut, trapping the suffocating afternoon heat inside the cavernous wood-paneled room. The collision course I initiated days prior, triggered by a $500 check slid across a mahogany table, had finally reached its designated target. The gallery behind me was standing room only, packed shoulder to shoulder with the elite echelon of Lake Geneva high society. Vivian Mitchell rarely fought private battles. She treated conflicts like spectator sports, calling in favors and leveraging gossip to ensure an audience witnessed her triumphs. Real estate developers, local politicians, and country club socialites filled the wooden pews. They whispered behind manicured hands their expensive perfumes and colognes, mingling with the scent of institutional floor wax. My mother wanted a public execution. She needed her peers to watch her crush her rebellious, illegitimate daughter, proving she still possessed an iron grip over her crumbling domain. She believed an emergency eviction order would grant her the legal authority to liquidate the estate and escape the impending federal fallout. She sat on the witness stand exuding the polished, tragic confidence of old Wisconsin wealth. She wore a somber black dress, a single strand of authentic pearls resting against her collarbone. She looked like the picture of respectable, weary matriarchy. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, offering the judge a tight, sorrowful smile. Following Marcus Thorne's abrupt departure in the law firm lobby, Vivian had scrambled to retain a replacement. She found Arthur Vance, a defense attorney known for aggressive courtroom theatrics, a man entirely willing to overlook glaring ethical violations for a heavy cash retainer. Vance paced the floor in front of the jury box, his hands clasped behind his back. He paused to offer a solemn nod to the gallery before turning his attention to his client. "Tell the court about your daughter, Mrs. Mitchell Vance," prompted his voice, echoing with manufactured sympathy. "Tell us about the profound burden you and your late husband endured to provide for her." Vivian sighed, a masterful, heavy sound designed to convey decades of maternal exhaustion. She looked down at her hands, shaking her head slowly. "I love my child," Vivian lied, her tone dipping into a smooth register of theatrical sorrow. "But she has always struggled to find her footing in the real world. She lacks the ambition and stability required to maintain consistent employment. My late husband, God rest his soul, understood the toll her erratic behavior took on her mind. He made endless allowances for her. He offered her the historic guest house on our estate, hoping the quiet sanctuary would help her heal and eventually reintegrate into society." She paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring the courtroom absorbed her fabricated generosity. "We financed her entire life." Vivian continued, her voice tightening with feigned frustration. "We paid her living expenses. We covered her transportation. We expected her to rest and eventually find a path forward. Instead, she refused to work. She locked herself away, isolating her mind and draining our resources. Her issues mutated into paralyzing delusions. She treated my home with profound contempt, treating the estate staff like her personal servants." The narrative was sickeningly effective. Vivian was weaponizing the decade I spent building a covert financial empire, twisting my quiet independence into a portrait of a dangerous, lazy parasite. She painted herself as a tough love savior, forced to protect a historic Wisconsin legacy from a deeply disturbed squatter. Vance turned his back to the witness stand and pointed an accusatory finger directly at the defense table.
And how did the defendant repay this endless generosity, Vance demanded, raising his volume to fill the cavernous space. She vandalized my property.
Vivian answered, her jaw clenching as if fighting back righteous anger. When I finally asked her to contribute to the household, or at least begin preparing to vacate the premises following my husband's passing, she flew into a destructive rage. She smashed vintage fixtures. She tore holes through imported drywall. I was forced to file this emergency injunction for the safety of my own household.
She presented the fabricated repair invoices, framing them as undeniable proof of my instability.
She is a devoted mother, forced into a tragic corner, Vance declared, pacing toward the judge's bench. A towering local family held hostage by a parasite who refuses to launch. We demand the court uphold this lawful eviction to protect a woman who has given everything to her community.
Vance thanked the witness and walked back to the plaintiff table, projecting an aura of total victory.
The courtroom murmured in agreement. The sheer weight of Vivian's social influence pressed down on the defense table. The gallery glared at me, their eyes practically burning holes into the back of my plain tailored blazer. They wanted to see me break. They wanted the troubled daughter to lower her head and weep in shame. The tension in the room hit an unbearable, suffocating peak. The judge, an older woman with stern features, leaned forward, her expression reflecting genuine sympathy for the grieving widow on the stand. She looked down at me, her brow furrowed in severe disapproval. I sat beside Julianne, keeping my hands resting loosely in my lap. My pulse hovered at a steady, resting rhythm. I absorbed the collective hatred of the room without a single flicker of emotion on my face. When you spend 10 years anticipating a war, a civilian courtroom feels remarkably predictable. Does the defense wish to cross-examine the witness? The judge asked, her tone implying she considered it a waste of the court's valuable time. Julian Sterling did not fumble his pen or drop his notes. He did not adopt the rumpled, incompetent persona he wore during the mediation. He stood up, slowly adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket. His posture straightened, assuming the commanding, lethal presence of a senior corporate litigator. Vivian had built her entire legal strategy on emotional manipulation. She claimed her vast wealth financed my existence. She claimed she was a benevolent provider offering charity from an overflowing vault. To destroy a narcissist, you do not attack their emotions or argue over fabricated property damage. You attack their ledger. Julian stepped out from behind the defense table. He did not carry a box of tissues to counter Vivian's tears, nor did he carry counter-estimates to dispute the vandalism invoices. He carried a single, thick folder marked with a bright red tab. He walked toward the center of the courtroom, stopping a few feet from the wooden railing of the witness stand. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose, looking directly at my mother. Mrs. Mitchell, Julian began his tone mild and conversational. You painted a very vivid picture during your direct examination. You described yourself as a generous provider, an overflowing well of charity who financed my client's life. You told this court that her dependents drained your resources. Vivian jutted her chin forward, soaking in the phrasing. She dabbed at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. That is correct, counselor. I gave her everything. Julian nodded slowly, staring down at the floorboards as if lost in thought. A benevolent provider indeed. However, courts often struggle to understand abstract concepts of wealth. I think it would be helpful to quantify this profound financial burden you carried, just to establish a baseline for the record. Exactly how deep is this well of charity? Arthur Vance, the slick defense attorney, half rose from his seat at the plaintiff table, his predatory instincts flaring. He opened his mouth to object, sensing a trap regarding relevance, but Vivian waved him down with a sharp flick of her wrist. My mother was an incurable narcissist. Her entire identity, her entire sense of self-worth was tied to a ledger. The opportunity to boast about her net worth in front of a gallery packed with her country club peers was an irresistible bait. She could not pass up a chance to declare her superiority on the public record. She needed the room to believe the grand illusion. I am the sole beneficiary of a highly successful commercial logistics empire, Vivian boasted, projecting her voice toward the gallery. I manage vast real estate holdings, including the Lake Geneva estate. My personal and corporate portfolio holds a liquid valuation exceeding $40 million. A collective murmur of awe rippled through the packed pews. Local developers nodded in respect. Vivian soaked it in a smug, self-satisfied sneer, pulling at the corners of her mouth. She actually believed that if she stated the number out loud with enough conviction, it would magically become true. I sat at the defense table feeling the delicious, icy weight of dramatic irony settle over the room. The audience, the judge, and the opposing counsel all believed they were looking at an untouchable titan of Wisconsin society. I knew they were looking at a dead woman walking. $40 million, Julian repeated, testing the words on his tongue as if they tasted sour. A formidable sum, truly the mark of an empire. A woman with those resources would certainly hold unparalleled authority over her domain. Let us take a closer look at that bulletproof portfolio, shall we? Julian stopped pacing. The conversational tone vanished entirely, leaving behind a cold, surgical, legal executioner. He did not return to the defense table. He walked straight to the judge's elevated bench. "Your Honor," Julian announced, his voice crisp, lethal, and echoing to the back row of the gallery. "The defense submits Exhibit C into evidence. This folder contains certified, unredacted banking record subpoenas, executed and verified by federal authorities mere hours ago." The judge took the red folder. The courtroom fell into a breathless hush. Mrs. Mitchell claims a liquid net worth of $40 million. Julian continued, turning slowly to face the gallery. She claims to be a benevolent provider, drained by the financial burden of her daughter. The certified ledgers in the judge's hands tell a starkly different story. Vance scrambled out from behind his table, panic finally hijacking his polished exterior. "Objection. We have not been provided these documents in discovery. This is a blind ambush. These documents were generated and certified over the weekend," Counselor Julian shot back, his gaze locking on to the opposing lawyer. "They are matters of public commercial record as of this morning. You would know that if your client had not concealed her catastrophic insolvency from her own legal counsel." The judge flipped the folder open. Her eyes scanned the top page. Her stern judicial frown deepened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "Let us examine the overflowing vault," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register that commanded the entire room. "Those records prove Vivian Mitchell is currently $30 million in the red. She has defaulted on 3 separate commercial strip malls in the past 90 days. The logistics fleet was seized by municipal creditors yesterday afternoon. She holds 0 liquid assets, massive federal tax liens against her primary trusts, and a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices spanning 2 states." A single drop of sweat traced a path down Vivian's temple. Her hands began to tremble against the wooden railing. The color drained rapidly from her face, leaving a sickly, chalky pallor. "You do not possess $40 million, Vivian," Julian stated, turning to face her directly. "You are functionally bankrupt. You are drowning in toxic debt, and you attempted to use a fictitious narrative of a parasitic daughter to mask your own profound financial ruin so you could liquidate your final asset." The gallery erupted into frantic, shocked whispers. The illusion of wealth shattered into dust. Vivian was exposed as a desperate, sinking fraud who had lied under oath to save face. But a bankrupt woman could still own a house. A ruined mother could still evict a squatter. How did $30 million in commercial debt connect to the residential eviction notice sitting on the judge's desk? The answer resided on the final page of Julian's red folder. The perjury trap was sprung, and the final devastating boulder was hovering right above Vivian Mitchell's head. The tension inside the courtroom hung in the air like humidity before a severe thunderstorm. Julian Sterling turned away from the judge's bench and walked back toward our defense table. He did not retrieve a simple piece of paper or a standard legal pad. He reached down and hoisted a dense, leather-bound volume from his open briefcase. It was the unredacted Vanguard Holdings Master Ledger, a physical manifestation of a decade spent hunting in the shadows. Julian carried the heavy book to the center evidence podium. He raised it a few inches above the polished wood and let gravity do the work. The ledger struck the podium with a loud, resounding thud. The sharp noise echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, causing several socialites in the front row to physically jump. Vivian flinched in the witness chair. Her posture, previously rigid with country club defiance, began to curl inward. Let us break down the anatomy of your supposed empire. Mrs. Mitchell Julian stated, opening the thick leather cover, "You sat under oath and proudly claimed a net worth of $40 million. You presented yourself as a sovereign entity, immune to the financial realities that govern ordinary citizens. Let us review the current reality." He flipped to the first tab, his voice projecting a crisp, unyielding authority. Section 1 details your commercial real estate holdings. Julian began reading directly from the forensic audit. The 3 retail strip malls located in the greater Milwaukee area are not merely in default, they were formally seized by primary creditors early this morning. Private security firms have already changed the locks and boarded the entrances. Your holding company no longer possesses a single square foot of commercial retail space. Vivian opened her mouth, but her throat constricted. She emitted a faint, dry wheeze. She looked toward Arthur Vance, her expensive defense attorney, searching for an objection to stop the bleeding. Vance remained rooted to his chair, his eyes darting frantically across his own useless notes. He recognized a fatal corporate cross-examination when he saw one. Julian turned the page, the crisp paper rustling in the breathless quiet of the room. Section 2 outlines Mitchell logistics. Julian continued driving the blade deeper. The regional freight network your late husband built. As of 3 hours ago, state transportation authorities, acting on behalf of mezzanine debt holders, began impounding your remaining freight fleet at way stations across the Midwest. The keys have been confiscated. The drivers have been sent home. The logistics network has ceased all operations. The gallery behind me erupted into a fresh wave of horrified murmurs. Local developers and investors, people who had done business with my family for generations, exchanged panicked glances. They were calculating their own exposure to the Mitchell financial crater. Vivian was not just falling. She threatened to drag her associates down into the abyss with her. And finally, Section 3, Julian said, his tone dropping into a register of quiet devastation. The federal tax liens. You assumed hiding your personal living expenses behind an irrevocable trust would shield your liquid cash from corporate fallout. However, the Internal Revenue Service identified the fraudulent offshore transfers initiated by your son. They pierced the corporate veil yesterday evening. The federal liens are now attached directly to your personal Social Security number. You cannot withdraw a single dollar to buy a cup of coffee. Julian closed the heavy ledger. He looked directly into my mother's eyes. The Mitchell Empire is $30 million in the red, Julian declared, rendering the final verdict. You are entirely insolvent. The smug, theatrical matriarch sitting in the witness box disintegrated. Vivian lost control of her breathing. Short, ragged gasps rattled her chest. The authentic pearls resting against her collarbone trembled violently as her hands shook. She gripped the wooden railing of the stand so hard her knuckles turned stark white, clinging to the physical structure, as if it could keep her from drowning. She turned her head, casting a desperate, pleading look toward the gallery. She sought comfort from the elite women she had hosted at luncheons, the society peers she had considered her loyal subjects. She found only averted gazes and cold shoulders. Old money functions on a strict system of self-preservation. Poverty is treated as a highly contagious disease. The moment the local elites realized Vivian was bankrupt, the social execution was instantaneous. The women in the front row leaned away from her, whispering behind their hands, their eyes filled with harsh, unfiltered judgment. The queen was dead, and her former court was already eager to scavenge the ruins. Arthur Vance realized his client was bleeding out on the public stage. He knew the unpaid retainer sitting in his firm's account would likely bounce before the end of the day. But Vance was a veteran litigator with a bruised ego. He refused to lose a high-profile hearing without attempting a desperate counteroffensive. He shot up from the plaintiff table, knocking his chair backward. He slammed his hand against the wood, demanding the court's attention. "Objection, Your Honor," Vance shouted, his voice hoarse with exertion. "I move to strike this entire line of questioning from the record. Opposing counsel is utilizing a smokescreen to distract from the core legal issue." The judge looked up from the red folder, her stern features registering profound annoyance. "State your grounds, counselor." Vance stepped around his table, pacing aggressively to reclaim his lost momentum. "My client's corporate financial standing has zero legal bearing on a residential eviction proceeding," he argued, pointing a rigid finger at me. "Whether Mitchell Logistics is thriving or insolvent is entirely irrelevant. The Lake Geneva estate is shielded by a separate residential trust. It serves as my client's primary domicile. Corporate debt does not strip a widow of her private property rights." He turned to face the gallery, attempting to rally the sympathetic crowd one last time. "Adana Mitchell is a trespasser," Vance declared, his tone dripping with manufactured righteous indignation. "She occupies a guest house on private land. She caused immense property damage. The law explicitly grants the rightful property owner the authority to evict a destructive tenant regardless of external commercial failures. I demand this court uphold the eviction order so my client can secure her home and begin liquidating her assets to satisfy these very creditors." Vance stood tall, panting slightly. He believed he had found the legal loophole. He assumed that by separating the commercial bankruptcy from the residential deed, he could still grant Vivian the narrow victory she needed to survive the week. He thought the heavy walls of the family estate would protect her from the financial storm. It was a brilliant, desperate legal argument. In any other courtroom, against any other opponent, it might have worked. Julian did not argue. He did not offer a rebuttal or cite a conflicting legal precedent. He simply stood beside the evidence podium, his hands resting on the leather cover of the Vanguard ledger. He looked up at the elevated bench and offered the judge a polite, expectant nod. The judge ignored Arthur Vance entirely. She did not acknowledge his passionate defense of residential property rights. Her focus was captivated by the final addendum tucked inside the red folder Julian had provided minutes earlier. The courtroom descended into a thick, breathless silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the ragged, panicked breathing of my mother in the witness box. I sat at the defense table, watching the judge's eyes track back and forth across the dense legal text of the final document. I had spent 10 years waiting for this exact intersection of time and consequence. Every freezing night in my Milwaukee apartment, every grueling hour spent untangling forensic accounting data had been a single step toward this specific room. The judge finished reading. She set the crisp white paper down onto her mahogany desk. She reached up and slowly removed her reading glasses, folding the silver arms with deliberate precision. The stern, impartial lines of her face had melted away. Her expression morphed into a mask of profound, unadulterated shock. She looked down at the paper, then lifted her gaze to Arthur Vance, who was still standing in the center aisle, waiting for his triumphant ruling. She shifted her focus to Vivian, studying the trembling, hyperventilating woman who had just perjured herself on the public record. Finally, the judge looked past the plaintiff table and locked eyes directly with me. She saw through the faded civilian clothing. She recognized the architect of the invisible corporate siege. The judge let out a heavy, weary breath that carried through the courtroom microphone. She shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound disbelief aimed squarely at the high-priced defense attorney. So, they really do not know. Arthur Vance stood in the center aisle, his chest puffing with false confidence. He assumed the judge directed her bewildered question at the defense table. He believed his brilliant legal maneuvering had exposed a flaw in Julian Sterling's strategy. "Know what, Your Honor?" Vance asked, projecting his voice toward the elevated bench. "My client has established undisputed ownership of the residential property. The commercial debt is a separate entity. We request an immediate ruling on the eviction." The judge looked down at the slick defense attorney with profound pity. The stern, impartial lines of her face had softened into an expression of grim understanding. "You argued that corporate liabilities do not negate private property rights," Counselor the judge stated, her voice echoing through the silent room. "In a standard vacuum, you would be correct. However, your client concealed a critical detail regarding her financial portfolio." The judge tapped the crisp white paper resting on her desk. "The Lake Geneva estate is not shielded by an independent residential trust," she explained, educating the disgraced litigator. 6 months ago, it was pledged as cross-collateral to secure a $5 million offshore commercial loan. the exact same loan containing a forged guarantor signature. Your client legally tethered her home to the survival of the logistics firm. Vance froze. His predatory instincts abandoned him, leaving a terrified man drowning in an ocean of missing context. He slowly turned his head to look at Vivian. The matriarch shrank under his glare, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand. She had lied to her own counsel, leading him directly into a fatal trap. When Mitchell Logistics defaulted on their obligations, the primary creditors sought to mitigate their losses. The judge continued delivering the fatal blow with surgical detachment. They bundled the toxic debts and sold them on the secondary market last weekend. A private equity firm purchased the entire portfolio for pennies on the dollar. A collective gasp rippled through the packed pews behind me. The local elites were piecing the puzzle together in real time. The acquiring entity is Vanguard Holdings, the judge announced. Because the commercial properties were entirely underwater, the purchasing firm exercised a lawful, expedited foreclosure on the secondary collateral to satisfy the outstanding margin calls. The transaction cleared the county clerk office 48 hours ago. Vivian stopped breathing. A physical jolt racked her frame. Her chest heaved as if the air had been suddenly siphoned from the room. The grand estate, the sprawling lakeside mansion she used to intimidate her peers and project her untouchable status, was gone. They hold the unencumbered title, the judge declared. Mrs. Mitchell, you no longer own the property. Vance scrambled to salvage his ruined reputation. Even if a foreclosure occurred, the eviction process mandates a 30-day grace period. Vanguard Holdings is a corporate entity operating out of Chicago. They cannot bypass state tenant rights to execute a summary removal. The judge shook her head slowly. Vanguard Holdings is not a faceless corporation in Chicago. The founder and chief executive officer is sitting in this courtroom today. The judge turned her gaze past the plaintiff table and looked directly at me. The camouflage dissolved. The rural clinic employee narrative evaporated into the sterile air conditioning of the courthouse. This court formally recognizes Adana Mitchell as the sole legal owner of the Lake Geneva estate. The judge stated, her words dropping like heavy stones into a stagnant pond. She does not just own the commercial debt. She owns the bank that processed the loans, and as of 48 hours ago, she legally owns the very chair your client is currently sitting in. The silence shattered. A shockwave of sheer chaos ripped through the gallery. The Wisconsin elite erupted into unbridled pandemonium. Men in tailored suits leaned over the wooden pews, their mouths hanging open. Women clutched their designer handbags, staring at me as if I had materialized from thin air. The daughter they had mocked as a pathetic, unstable outcast was a financial leviathan who had just methodically swallowed the reigning queen of local society whole. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the seismic shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, oppressive shadow my family cast over my life lifted, vanishing forever. I had not engaged in a screaming match. I had not offered a tearful plea for familial mercy. I simply bought the ground beneath their feet and pulled the rug out. Vivian remained trapped in the witness box. Her eyes bulged wide with stark terror. The arrogant smirk, the towering patriarchal authority she inherited from my father, the illusion of her untouchable wealth, it was all instantly deleted. It is a forgery. Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch that stripped away decades of refined etiquette. She pointed a trembling finger at the judge. She is a low-level clerk. She does not possess the capital to buy a strip mall, let alone my entire portfolio. This is a fraudulent shell game. I demand a federal investigation. Her denial did not alter reality. It only amplified her humiliation. The peers she invited to watch my destruction were now witnessing her spectacular psychological collapse. Near the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, a secondary drama unfolded. Preston had slipped into the gallery earlier, hiding in the shadows of the back row. He came, hoping his mother would secure a swift victory, desperate to drain whatever cash she might extract from the estate sale to fund his criminal defense. Hearing the words forged guarantor and federal investigation, his survival instinct kicked in. He turned around, shoving his way past a group of stunned developers. He reached for the brass handles, intent on fleeing the building and disappearing before the authorities connected the offshore accounts to his specific routing numbers. He pushed the doors open, stepping out into the marble hallway. He did not find an empty escape route. Waiting in the corridor were 3 men wearing dark, conservative suits and displaying silver federal badges on their belts. The regulators had tracked the embezzlement trail directly from the logistics firm to the courthouse. The gallery fell silent, their attention pulled toward the open doorway. Everyone watched as the federal agents intercepted the golden boy of the Mitchell dynasty. Preston did not fight. He lacked the spine for physical confrontation. His shoulders slumped in total defeat as an agent secured his wrists in steel restraints. The metallic click echoed into the courtroom, a definitive sound sealing his fate. They turned him around and marched him down the hall, escorting him toward a mandated 20-year prison sentence. Vivian watched her son disappear. The final tether anchoring her to sanity snapped. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the wooden railing of the witness stand, emitting a low, hollow moan. Arthur Vance quietly backed away from his client. He realized he was standing in the blast radius of a legal catastrophe. He packed his platinum briefcase, his hands moving with frantic speed, eager to abandon the sinking ship before the judge scrutinized his own involvement in the perjury. The judge raised her wooden gavel high above the sounding block. The plaintiff possesses no legal standing to request an eviction from a property she does not own, the judge announced, her voice cutting through the lingering murmurs. This petition is dismissed with prejudice. The gavel struck the block. The sharp, echoing crack signaled the definitive end of the Mitchell empire. I stood up from the defense table. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal blazer. I did not rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator surveying a conquered territory. I radiated a quiet, unassailable power that forced the surrounding crowd to instinctively step back. I walked up the center aisle, leaving Julian to organize our files. I bypassed the empty plaintiff table and approached the witness stand where my mother remained slumped in defeat. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against a crisp piece of heavy cardstock. I pulled it out, holding the bright yellow document in my right hand. It was the physical manifestation of a decade spent in exile. Vivian slowly lifted her head. Her mascara ran in dark, messy tracks down her pale cheeks. The silver hair she spent hours styling was disheveled. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a microscopic shred of the familial mercy she had denied me my entire life. I did not offer comfort. I handed her the bright yellow document. It was a 24-hour emergency eviction notice, fully authorized under the expedited terms of the commercial foreclosure. Get off my property. The sun had not yet crested the horizon when I arrived at the Lake Geneva estate the following morning. The temperature hovered near zero, and a bitter wind whipped off the frozen surface of the water, carrying biting ice crystals through the bare branches of the ancient oak trees. The serene, secluded quiet of the rural shoreline was broken by the guttural roar of heavy diesel engines. 2 county sheriff cruisers sat parked at sharp angles near the grand entrance, their red and blue light bars cutting harsh, rhythmic shadows across the snow-covered lawn. Behind the cruisers, a fleet of commercial tow trucks and moving vans idled, their exhaust plumes billowing into the frigid morning air. The repossession agents worked with blue-collar efficiency, attaching thick steel chains to the axles of the remaining luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. Preston had managed to post bail around 3 a.m, draining a hidden emergency account to secure his temporary release pending a formal federal arraignment. He returned to his childhood sanctuary, hoping to salvage whatever cash or valuables he could carry. He arrived just in time to watch the bank reclaim his prized imported sports car. The heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion were propped open, letting the freezing wind sweep through the grand corridors. Inside the vaulted foyer, the carefully curated illusion of untouchable prestige had dissolved into frantic desperation. My mother emerged from the shadows of the entrance. The visual contrast was staggering. The woman who had spent her entire adult life wrapped in vintage Chanel and authentic pearls was wearing faded, generic gray sweatpants and a shapeless parka. Her silver hair, usually styled into a flawless helmet of perfection, hung loose and tangled around her face. She lacked any trace of makeup, revealing the deep, exhausted lines etched into her pale skin. Vivian dragged a heavy black plastic trash bag down the stone steps. She was not carefully packing her belongings into leather steamer trunks. She was frantically shoving whatever silk blouses and cashmere sweaters she could snatch from her closet into cheap plastic. The bag caught on a jagged edge of the masonry. The thin material tore open, spilling a cascade of expensive designer fabrics onto the wet, frost-covered grass. She did not even stop to retrieve them. She just kept walking, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking against the cold. Preston stumbled out of the house behind her. He wore the same wrinkled suit from the courtroom, now stained and reeking of the federal holding cell. He carried a small cardboard box filled with loose watches and a few framed photographs. He saw me standing near the hood of my sedan, flanked by private security and the local deputies. He dropped the box. The glass frames shattered upon impact with the frozen gravel. He staggered forward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the icy stones. He closed the distance between us, but my security detail stepped forward, forming a physical barricade. I raised a single hand, signaling them to hold their position. Preston stopped 3 feet away from my boots. The golden boy, the heir apparent, who had demanded I take a $500 check just a few days prior, lost his final shred of dignity. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the sharp gravel, dropping heavily in front of me.
"Adana, please," he rasped, his voice a pathetic, wet whisper. The federal prosecutors froze everything. The bail bondsman took the last of the liquid cash. I do not even have enough money to rent a motel room. The judge seized my passport. I have nowhere to go. You cannot leave me to freeze on the street. I am your brother. We share the same blood. You owe me a roof over my head. Just let me stay in the guest house. I looked down at the man kneeling in the dirt. I thought about the decade of isolation, the constant belittling, the way he stole from his clients to fund a ski chalet while mocking my humble apartment. I tilted my head, studying him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a dying specimen. "You loved giving me lectures about reality, Preston," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the howling wind. "You loved tossing checks across mahogany tables and dictating how the world worked. You told me to face the harshness of the real world." He looked up at me, his face twisted in horror. He knew exactly what was coming. "In the real world," I stated, delivering the words with unapologetic finality, "men who commit federal fraud do not get to live in lakefront estates. I will lend you $500 for a moving truck." He gasped, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. The finality of my statement struck him like a physical blow. The last tiny ember of hope in his eyes extinguished entirely, leaving behind nothing but the dark, terrifying reality of his ruined life. I turned my head and caught the eye of the lead sheriff. "Time is up," I announced. The deputy stepped forward, grasping Preston by the arms and hauling his frame to his feet. He did not fight. He wept openly as they guided him and Vivian past the wrought iron gates. The gates swung shut with a loud, reverberating clang that echoed across the water, sealing the past away forever. 3 months passed, trading the bitter, freezing winter for a bright, vibrant Wisconsin spring. The oppressive darkness that had plagued the Lake Geneva estate was gone. I stood in the center of the expansive living room, adjusting the cuff of my tailored emerald gown. The vast crystal chandeliers illuminated a space filled with warmth, life, and genuine purpose. The heavy, intimidating antiques and suffocating portraits of old men had been sold at auction or hauled to the landfill. The walls were painted in bright, welcoming tones. Tonight was the inaugural charity gala for the Vanguard Women's Initiative. I had purposely transformed the ultimate symbol of my father's fragile ego into a fortress of empowerment. We were raising critical funds to provide immediate legal representation and emergency capital for individuals escaping domestic and familial financial abuse. We were giving vulnerable people the exact strategic weapon I had been forced to build for myself from scratch. The grand ballroom was packed with powerful investors, brilliant legal minds, and brave survivors who now had a voice. Across the room, a muted, flat-screen television displayed the local evening news. The broadcast featured a brief update on the Mitchell scandal.
Preston was sitting at a defense table in a federal courthouse wearing a shapeless orange jumpsuit. He had pleaded guilty to embezzlement and wire fraud, currently awaiting a mandated sentencing hearing that would keep him behind bars for decades. Vivian had retreated into profound obscurity. Stripped of her wealth and her social standing, she was currently renting a cramped 200-square-foot apartment above a noisy laundromat on the outskirts of Milwaukee. She spent her days attempting to sell her remaining scuffed designer shoes on internet auction sites, entirely isolated from the elite society she once ruled. I picked up a crystal flute of sparkling water from a passing tray and walked toward the heavy French doors. I stepped out onto the expansive marble balcony, letting the gentle evening breeze catch the edge of my gown. The music from the string quartet playing inside drifted over the rolling, perfectly manicured lawns. Resting against the stone balustrade was the final remnant of the old regime. It was the hideous, imposing oil painting of my father that used to hang in the grand foyer. The artist had captured his arrogant sneer perfectly. I set my glass down. I gripped the heavy gilded frame with both hands. I hoisted the portrait over the edge of the stone railing and let go. The painting plummeted downward, crashing directly into a large industrial dumpster parked in the service driveway below. The canvas tore upon impact, the gilded frame splintering into useless fragments of wood and gold leaf. I looked out over the serene moonlit water of the lake. Society spends generations conditioning people to accept the meager scraps thrown to them by entitled patriarchs, demanding toxic loyalty to keep the family harmony intact. But true power is never inherited. It is not granted through a will or secured through fraudulent bank loans. True power is built on undeniable, unassailable independence. It is built on bedrock. The dust has finally settled over the Lake Geneva estate. The heavy diesel tow trucks have long since departed. The frantic screams have faded into the chill Wisconsin wind, and the grand mahogany doors no longer guard an empire of lies. When we survey the wreckage of the Mitchell dynasty, the immediate takeaway seems to be a straightforward cautionary tale about corporate greed and financial ruin. We see defaulted commercial loans, federal indictments, and millions of dollars evaporating overnight. But if you strip away the zeros from the bank ledgers and brush aside the ashes of the ruined real estate portfolio, you uncover a much quieter, far more devastating tragedy. It is a tragedy that has absolutely nothing to do with money. At its core, the collapse of this family was a profound, catastrophic failure of parenting. In modern American culture, it is remarkably easy to confuse financial provision with actual parenting. We are conditioned by society to celebrate the outward markers of success, the sprawling suburban homes, the designer labels, the elite university decals plastered on the back of luxury vehicles. There is a pervasive, unspoken belief that a parent's primary duty is to construct a fortress of material comfort to shield their children from the harshness of the world. Vivian and her late husband embodied this relentless pursuit. They built a glittering facade of country club memberships and corporate dominance, genuinely believing that proximity to wealth equated to familial devotion. They viewed their children not as human beings with unique emotional landscapes, but as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. They loved the idea of a perfect, highly marketable family, but they lacked the emotional awareness required to actually cultivate one. A traditional family structure cannot survive on a foundation of currency alone. It requires the invisible, unglamorous bedrock of honesty, fundamental fairness, and deep emotional intelligence. When we examine the divergent paths of the Mitchell children, we witness a masterclass in emotional negligence. Preston was designated the golden heir from birth. He was draped in privilege, handed executive titles he never earned, and shielded from every difficult truth. Whenever he shattered a sports car or failed a moral test, his parents quietly wrote a check to erase the consequence. They thought they were protecting him. In reality, they were completely disarming him. By removing accountability, they raised a man who lacked the emotional resilience to navigate basic adversity. When the artificial safety net finally tore, he did not know how to stand on his own 2 feet. He resorted to federal embezzlement because he possessed no internal moral compass, only an insatiable appetite for the status he felt entitled to. His parents handed him a kingdom, but they failed to give him a spine. Their conditional, status-obsessed love ultimately paved his road to a federal prison cell. Then there was the scapegoat, the daughter thrown out into the freezing rain because she refused to sacrifice her integrity to protect a manufactured family image. In her parents' eyes, Adana was a liability the moment she failed to conform to their toxic narrative. Instead of offering emotional safety, they offered cruel ultimatums. Instead of fairness, they practiced extortion. This is the great, silent danger of raising children without emotional awareness. When parents project their own unresolved insecurities, raging egos, and status anxieties onto their offspring, the home ceases to be a sanctuary. It becomes a battlefield. A parent's true responsibility is not to mold a child into a shiny trophy that reflects well on the family name at a local luncheon. It is to guide them toward becoming honest, self-sufficient, and compassionate adults. That requires the humility to listen, the fairness to treat siblings as equals regardless of their compliance, and the profound courage to admit when the parent themselves has made a mistake. Adana survived by turning her trauma into impenetrable armor. She learned the ultimate lesson of American resilience. You must hold the bedrock. You must anchor yourself to the unshakable principles of integrity and self-reliance, so that when the storms of life inevitably arrive, you are not washed away. But a child should never have to wage a decade-long war to survive the people who brought them into the world. Generational wealth is a frequent talking point in our society, but we rarely discuss generational trauma and generational character. What are we actually handing down to our children if we leave them millions of dollars in a trust fund, but fail to teach them the value of a hard day's work, the importance of telling the truth, and the absolute necessity of taking responsibility for their actions? We are simply handing them a loaded weapon. We share these deeply personal, complex narratives because there is immense power in recognizing our own reflections in the stories of others. If you have ever felt like the outcast in your own home, or if you are currently navigating the difficult journey of breaking toxic cycles to build your own bedrock, you are not alone. There is a whole community of people learning to redefine what family truly means. We invite you to be part of that ongoing conversation. Please drop a comment with your thoughts, hit the like button, and be sure to subscribe to Maria Tells Stories. We continually explore the hidden corners of family dynamics, the triumphs of the underestimated, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken. As the golden lights of the charity gala twinkle across the sprawling, reclaimed lawns of the estate, the string music drifts up toward a vast, star-filled sky. The air is peaceful now, but the silence leaves room for a lingering, profound question. When the performative smiles fade, when the checking accounts are closed, and when the heavy front doors of your own home are locked for the night, what is actually holding up the roof? Look closely at the foundation you are laying today within your own walls. Are you building a castle on shifting sand, desperate for the world's applause? Or are you quietly, methodically laying down the bedrock? The answer will not just determine your own future, it will echo through the lives of your children long after you are gone, waiting in the dark to see if the structure holds.